Hey guys, tonight we're taking a journey, a long, slow journey back in time, all the way to Imperial China. I want you to close your eyes, if you feel comfortable. And imagine you're not sitting in your cozy bed, but rather, you're standing on a dusty, unpaved road. The air is thick with the scent of wood smoke and a dozen other things you can't quite place. Maybe it's a hint of fermenting rice, or the earthy smell of a muddy river, or maybe just the general funk of 1,000 people living in very close proximity. The sun beats down, hot and unforgiving. You're wearing a simple hemp robe that's a bit too scratchy, and your feet are caked in the kind of dirt that never really washes off. A cart rumbles past, piled high with ceramic pots, and you have to jump out of the way to avoid being splattered with mud. The driver doesn't even spare you a glance. You probably won't survive this. In fact, if you're being honest with yourself, you probably wouldn't last a day. The smallest misstep, a tiny misunderstanding, a misplaced word, and your life could change for the worse, or just end altogether. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as you get settled in, feel free to drop your location and your local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. All right, so you've arrived. And the first thing you need to understand is that Imperial China isn't just a country. It's a concept, an entire universe built on a single, powerful idea, the mandate of heaven. This isn't just some religious belief, it's the very foundation of society. The reason your emperor sits on his throne and you are currently standing in the dirt. The mandate says that the heavens, a cosmic, all-powerful force, have chosen a single individual to rule over all of China. This ruler, the Son of Heaven, has a divine right to govern. His rule is not about popular vote or military might alone, it's a cosmic seal of approval. The emperor's job is to maintain peace, prosperity, and order. If he does, everything in the world works as it should. The rivers don't flood, the crops grow, and people are generally content. If he fails, it's a sign, floods, famines, rebellions, these are all messages from the heavens. A clear signal that the emperor has lost his mandate. This is the mainstream historical fact that governed every aspect of life. It's a beautiful idea. In a way, you're not ruled by a king who just happens to be strong, but by a person who is supposed to be the most virtuous and wise. At least, that's the theory. Of course, the reality is a little different. How do you, a simple farmer or merchant, know if the heavens have withdrawn their support? Well, a peasant uprising is usually a good clue. A lot of historians still argue whether the mandate of heaven was a genuine spiritual belief for most people, or if it was just a clever political tool used by ambitious warlords to justify overthrowing a weak dynasty. For the average person, it was a bit of both. You might have deeply believed in the mandate, but you also knew that a bad harvest meant your emperor wasn't doing his job, and a new one was probably on the way. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. The early Zhou dynasty, which first introduced the mandate of heaven, even had a sort of check engine light for their rulers. A bronze vessel, called the ding, was said to be the symbol of the mandate. If an emperor was truly losing his power, it was said the ding would become unsteady or even fall. Of course, this was more of a legend than a measurable thing, but it was a great way for a rival to say, "Look, the heavens are literally shaking their heads at this guy." And you, the common person, would be expected to just accept this explanation. Your life wasn't about questioning the cosmos, it was about surviving the next harvest, and you'll have to survive many more things, because this idea of a divinely ordained ruler leads to some very strict consequences. The next dynasty you're about to face, the Qin, will take this idea of absolute power and run with it, using it to justify a level of control and cruelty you can barely imagine. So, take a deep breath and get ready, because things are about to get a whole lot less pleasant. So, you've got the mandate of heaven buzzing in the back of your mind. It's a good concept to keep front and center, because it explains everything, from the grand pageantry of the imperial court to the price of a single turnip at the market. You see, the emperor isn't just the boss, he's the cosmic link between the human world and the celestial sphere. His virtue, or lack thereof, literally dictates the weather. Seriously, if there's a drought, It's not a natural phenomenon, it's because the emperor has been less than perfectly virtuous. If there's a flood, you can bet the official report will blame the emperor's lack of filial piety or some other moral failing, not just a bunch of rain. You might hear people whispering about it in hushed tones, wondering if the Son of Heaven has been eating too much of the good stuff or forgetting to perform the proper rituals. This is the mainstream historical fact that you'd live with every single day. Your fate, and the fate of your crops, is tied directly to the emperor's moral compass. This leads to a quirky tidbit you might find rather strange. One of the emperor's most important duties was to perform the sacrifice to heaven at the Temple of Heaven in Beijing. This wasn't a quick prayer, it was an elaborate, hours-long ritual. The emperor would ascend a 3-tiered marble altar, surrounded by musicians and chanters. He would fast, wear special robes, and offer up gifts of silk and jade, all to ensure the cosmic harmony of the universe remained intact. The whole ceremony was a carefully choreographed performance, a public display of the emperor's spiritual authority. Now, think about that. This guy's entire job, a huge part of it anyway, was to stand on a platform and perform a symbolic ritual for the entire country. It's like his job description was head of weather and general good vibes. It's a bit like a modern CEO having to perform a rain dance every quarter, but with way more silk robes and a much higher stakes. Historians still argue whether the mandate of heaven was the cause of China's cyclical dynastic changes, or simply the justification for them. Was it a genuine system of accountability that allowed for the peaceful, or at least justified, overthrow of a bad ruler? Or was it just a convenient excuse for powerful warlords and rivals to seize power whenever they felt strong enough, cloaking their ambition in a veil of cosmic destiny? You'd be forgiven for thinking it was a bit of both, from your vantage point. It's hard to tell the difference. All you know is that one day you have one emperor, and the next you have a new one, who claims the last guy was a total mess and the gods are now on his side. You just hope the new guy remembers to perform the rain-making ritual, because your crops are looking a little thirsty. Now, let's fast forward a bit. The Zhou dynasty, which gave us this whole mandate of heaven idea, eventually faded away, and in its place came a new, terrifying force. Imagine the most efficient, brutal, and utterly humorless government you can. Now multiply that by 1,000, that's the Qin dynasty. They took the idea of a centralized, all-powerful ruler and turned it into a cold, hard reality. They weren't interested in your feelings or your traditions. They were interested in one thing, order, and they would achieve that order at any cost. You're about to be subjected to a system called legalism. This is a philosophy that believes human beings are inherently bad and must be controlled through strict laws and harsh punishments. Forget about virtue and morality. The Qin cared only about obedience. They standardized weights, measures, even the axle length of carts so that every road could accommodate them. Everything was about control. Your life was no longer your own. It belonged to the state, and the state's demands were absolute. So, you can forget about your soft bed and your cozy life. You're about to be put to work, and the work is going to be incredibly hard. The Qin don't care about your complaints, your family, or your health. They only care about your labor, and they have an endless list of things they need built. You're standing on the same dusty road, but the atmosphere has changed. The whispers about the mandate of heaven are gone, replaced by the grim silence of obedience. You're now living under the Qin dynasty, and believe me, you wouldn't last a day. This is the era of legalism, a philosophy that sees people as inherently selfish and untrustworthy. The only way to maintain order, they believe, is through a brutal system of laws and punishments. This is your reality now. Forget about moral arguments or personal freedom. Your life is governed by a simple, terrifying logic: obey or be punished. Your value isn't measured by your virtue, but by your usefulness to the state, and the state is currently very, very useful. Your village is part of a larger network, organized into small 10-family groups. This is a mainstream historical fact of the Qin era, a system known as Baoye. Every member of your group is responsible for the actions of the others. If your neighbor steals a cabbage, and you don't report it, you are punished just as harshly as they are. This creates a society of constant surveillance and suspicion. You can't trust anyone, and no one trusts you. You have to be a snitch just to survive. It's like a terrible, ancient version of a neighborhood watch, but with way more bamboo beatings and public shaming. You try to keep a low profile, but with this system, your low profile is your neighbor's business. Here's a quirky tidbit that really hammers home the Qin's obsession with control. They had a standardized measurement for everything: down to the length of a cart's axle. The idea was that every cart could travel on the same set of ruts in the road, making trade and military movements more efficient. It sounds like a good idea on paper, right? But the reality was that if your cart's axle was off by even a tiny fraction, you could be fined or worse. So, you're not just worried about getting your crops to market, you're also worried about getting your cart measured and approved by a government official who probably got out of bed on the wrong side that morning. It's the kind of bureaucratic overreach that would make a modern tax accountant blush. Historians still argue whether the extreme centralization and harsh legalism of the Qin dynasty were a necessary evil to unify a fractured, warring China, or if they were an unsustainable form of totalitarianism that was always doomed to fail. You might think about this as you see a man being publicly flogged for a minor offense. You don't have time for philosophical debates. All you know is that the laws are everywhere and the punishments are swift. The Qin emperor, Qin Shi Huang, is a figure of almost mythic proportions. A man so obsessed with power and immortality that he would stop at nothing to secure his legacy. He's the one who consolidated the warring states, and he's the one who began the most infamous construction project in human history. This project, of course, is the Great Wall, and you're about to become intimately familiar with it. The wall wasn't just a single barrier, but a series of fortifications, watchtowers, and natural defences that snaked across the northern frontier. It was built to keep out the nomadic raiders from the north, and it was built at an incredible human cost. Your life as a farmer is over for now. You've been conscripted, a common fate for men in this era. The order came down, and you had no choice. You're now part of a forced labour gang, trudging north. The journey is long and difficult, the weather is getting colder, and you're wearing the same scratchy robe. You can't help but wonder if you'll ever see your family again. The rumours say that for every 10 men sent to work on the wall, only one comes back. You hope you're the lucky one, but right now, you're just another pair of hands, another body to be used and discarded, and you're walking toward an endless, grueling task that will define the rest of your short life. You've been marching for weeks, a slow, shuffling line of conscripted labour, the Qin's great project, the one you've heard whispered about in terrified tones, is now your grim reality. You're part of the team building the Great Wall, a serpentine fortress of stone, earth, and bone that stretches across the horizon. This isn't a single, continuous wall like you might imagine from a modern documentary. This is a mainstream historical fact that few people grasp. The Great Wall was, and still is, a complex system of fortifications, walls, watchtowers, barracks, and signal stations that were often built on existing natural barriers like mountains and ridges. The point was not to create an impenetrable barrier, but rather to control movement, communicate military signals, and, most importantly, project a sense of power. But to you, it's just a mountain of work. Your days are a grueling cycle of quarrying rock, pounding earth, and hauling massive stones up steep inclines. The overseers, with their whips and their cold, unforgiving eyes, are the only thing that moves faster than you do. You're given just enough food to keep you on your feet, and just enough water to keep you from fainting. You're not a person anymore. You're just a cog in a vast, indifferent machine. And the machine is relentless. You're told this is for the good of the empire, to protect against the nomadic Xiongnu raiders from the north, but all you feel is the ache in your back and the chafing of the hemp rope on your shoulders. Here's a quirky tidbit that you might find macabre, but it's a part of the grim folklore surrounding the wall's construction. There's a legend that the dead bodies of workers were simply used as filler inside the wall itself. The saying goes, each stone of the Great Wall cost a human life. While most historians dismiss this as a myth, the fact that such a story even exists tells you everything you need to know about the horrifying conditions and the sheer scale of the human sacrifice involved. Whether your fallen comrade's body is literally inside the wall or just buried in a shallow grave beside it, the final destination is the same. The Qin dynasty, in its pursuit of eternal order, was willing to consume its own people. It's a bit like building a skyscraper today out of the bodies of the people who were supposed to work in it, only somehow. This feels even more soul-crushing. Historians still argue whether the wall was an effective military defense or a massive vanity project for Qin Shi Huang. While it did serve to define the border and provide a communication network, it was also often breached. Its true value might have been more symbolic, a grand statement of power and an immense public works project that kept a restive populace busy and under control. From your perspective, you don't care about its strategic value. All you know is that you're a part of it, a nameless, forgotten body pushing a heavy stone up a muddy hill. The sun sets, painting the sky in fiery hues, but you can't appreciate the beauty. You're too tired. You just want to collapse and hope you wake up in the morning. The fall of the Qin dynasty, surprisingly, happened soon after its founder's death. It was a testament to the fact that you can only push people so far before they break. The legalistic policies were too harsh, the demands too great, and the centralized power too fragile. The entire system collapsed into chaos, a fitting end for a regime built on tyranny. From the ashes of that brutal empire, a new one would rise, one that, at least on the surface, seemed to be a little more human. You're about to transition from the Qin to the Han dynasty, a new era that would last for 400 years, and while the laws might be a little less brutal, you'll discover that the state's control over your life is no less complete, it's just more subtle. You're about to trade the whip for the pen. The dust of the Qin dynasty is settling, and a new era, the Han dynasty, has begun. You're no longer a nameless body on the Great Wall, but you're still not entirely free. While the Han rulers eased the brutal legalist policies of the Qin, they replaced them with something just as powerful: bureaucracy. This is the mainstream historical fact that now governs your life. The Han dynasty didn't just rule, it managed. It was a vast, sprawling machine of paper, ink, and officials, all dedicated to the smooth running of the empire. This isn't a simple king and his court, it's a system of thousands of civil servants, from the highest-ranking minister to the lowest scribe in a remote county office. Your life is no longer at the mercy of a single, tyrannical emperor, but is now subject to the whims of countless faceless officials. Your greatest challenge isn't surviving a public flogging anymore, it's navigating this complex web of paperwork and officialdom. You want to buy a piece of land, you need a form. You want to pay your taxes, you need a form. You have a dispute with a neighbor, you go to the local magistrate, who is not a warrior but an official who is part of this vast bureaucratic network. You'll spend countless hours waiting in drafty offices, trying to bribe a low-level clerk with a few coins to get your request processed faster. The system is slow, often corrupt, and maddeningly impersonal. But it's also, in a strange way, a stabilizing force. It keeps the empire running, even when the emperor is weak or incompetent. Here's a quirky tidbit you might find interesting. The Han dynasty developed an official state calendar that was meticulously maintained by a specific bureau. This wasn't just for tracking dates, it was a way of standardizing time across the empire, ensuring that everyone planted and harvested at the same time and that rituals were performed on the correct days. This sounds simple, but it was a massive administrative undertaking. It's a bit like a modern-day GPS that also tells you when to have dinner with your family. The state's obsession with order and efficiency trickled down to every corner of your life, even to the timing of your daily chores. Historians still argue whether the Han civil service system was truly meritocratic or just a way for the wealthy elite to maintain power. While the system was technically open to anyone who could pass the exams, the reality was that only the rich could afford the years of study required to prepare. You'd see a peasant's son who was clearly brilliant but could never dream of becoming an official because he had to work in the fields. The system was an elegant idea, but in practice, it often just reinforced the existing social hierarchy. But this system also gave birth to a new class of people who would come to define Chinese society for the next 2 millennia, the scholar officials. We'll get to them next, but for now, you just need to understand that the pen is now mightier than the sword. Instead of conscripting you for hard labor, the Han state wants to tax you, to count you, and to manage every aspect of your life. And it does this not through brute force, but through an endless stream of regulations and forms. So you're a farmer, or maybe a small-time merchant. Your life is no longer about dodging the whip of a Qin overseer. It's about dealing with the endless layers of bureaucracy. You need a license to sell your goods in the city. You need to register the birth of your child. You need to pay your taxes on time. And the tax official is not a friendly man. He sits behind a small desk, surrounded by scrolls, and he doesn't care about your sob story. He only cares that you have the correct forms and the correct amount of grain. It's not as immediately terrifying as the Qin, but it's a slow, grinding reality that can wear you down just as effectively. You are a number in a ledger, a line on a scroll, and you are entirely at the mercy of the system. The bureaucratic maze of the Han Dynasty has you feeling a bit lost, but there's a new path opening up, one that promises power without the need for a sword. You're witnessing the rise of the scholar official, a class of men who would become the lifeblood of Chinese governance for 2 millennia. This is the mainstream historical fact that separates the Han from the Qin. The Han realized that governing a massive empire required more than just brute force and a thick rulebook. It required educated men, people who understood history, philosophy, and the intricacies of the law. They created a civil service examination system, a revolutionary concept for its time. Theoretically, anyone, even a commoner, could take these exams and, if they did well enough, secure a position in the government. You might see a young man from a well-off family, but not of the nobility, spending his entire life studying the Confucian classics, his only hope for social mobility resting on his ability to write a perfect essay. The exams were grueling. They lasted for days and covered everything from history and literature to law and military strategy. The most prestigious exams were held in the capital, and a successful candidate would be celebrated like a modern-day rock star. His name would be published, and he would be granted a position in the government, sometimes a very high one. This system, for all its flaws, created a meritocratic ideal that was almost unheard of in the rest of the world at the time. You might still be a farmer or a merchant, but you can look at the scholar official and see a path to a better life, a hope that your son or your grandson might not have to toil in the fields forever. Here's a quirky tidbit about the examination process. To prevent cheating, candidates were often locked in small, individual cubicles for the duration of the exam. These tiny rooms, just big enough for a desk and a bedroll, were meant to isolate the scholars completely. Imagine trying to write a complex philosophical essay in a tiny box for days on end, with nothing but a bowl of rice and a pot of tea for comfort. It was a test of not just intelligence, but of endurance and mental fortitude. It's a bit like a modern final exam, but with way more social pressure and a much higher chance of your dreams being crushed in a very small, very uncomfortable space. Historians still argue whether this system was a genuine path for social mobility or just a tool for the existing elite to maintain power. While it's true that some commoners did rise through the ranks, the vast majority of successful candidates came from the landed gentry who could afford to educate their sons from a young age. The scholar official class became a new elite, a group that valued scholarship and culture over military might. They were the ones who advised the emperor, drafted the laws, and ran the day-to-day business of the empire. They were, in a sense, the ultimate bureaucrats. Now, let's step away from the halls of power and into the city. All this talk of bureaucracy and scholar officials might make you forget that most people still lived a very different life. As the Han Dynasty flourished, its cities grew into bustling metropolises. You're about to leave your quiet village and enter a world of sensory overload, a place where people are packed together in a way you can barely comprehend. The city is a marvel of human ingenuity, but also a cauldron of disease and danger. You're about to experience what it's like to live in a Han Dynasty metropolis, a place of grand palaces and grimy alleys, of exquisite silks and rotting garbage. It's a place where you can find anything you want, and also a place where you can lose everything. You've made it. After all that talk of bureaucracy and scholarship, you've finally arrived at a major Han Dynasty city, and trust me, it's a lot to take in. This is not the quiet, pastoral life you knew. The air hits you first, a thick, layered scent of cooking oil, human waste, incense, and the perpetual, damp smell of wet earth. The streets are a chaotic river of humanity. You're jostled by vendors pushing carts laden with vegetables and silks, scholars on their way to the market, and beggars with outstretched hands. You have to be careful where you step. It's a sensory overload that's both exhilarating and terrifying. This is the bustling, crowded, and often unsanitary life that most people lived in a major urban centre. It's a mainstream historical fact that these cities were magnets for people seeking work and opportunity, but they came at a cost. Your first challenge is navigating the cramped hutongs, the narrow alleys and lanes that make up the residential districts. The homes are packed so tightly that you can hear your neighbours' every argument and celebration. Forget about personal space. The concept barely exists here. Your life is an open book to those around you, and theirs is to you. It's a close-knit community, but also one where a small disagreement can escalate into a massive feud in a matter of minutes. The lack of proper sanitation is obvious. Waste is often just thrown into the street, and a heavy rain can turn the entire city into a muddy, disease-ridden mess. This is a far cry from the serene images of a scholar's garden you might have in your head. Here's a quirky tidbit about city life. The Han Dynasty had a very particular way of dealing with urban crime. They had night watchmen who would patrol the streets and even lock the city gates at night. This wasn't just to keep outsiders out, it was to keep residents in and prevent nighttime crime. So, if you were a night owl, you were out of luck. You had to be home before the gong sounded, or you would be locked out of your own neighborhood until morning. Imagine trying to get home after a late-night feast only to find your entire street locked down. It was a strict measure for security, but it was also a major inconvenience for the average citizen. Historians still argue whether the Han Dynasty's urban planning, with its gridded streets and walled-off districts, was primarily a tool for social control or a practical response to the problems of managing a dense population. You might think it's both. The grids made it easier for officials to monitor residents and collect taxes, but they also made it easier for people to find their way around and for trade to flow. From your perspective, you're just trying to find a cheap place to eat that won't give you the dreaded stomach rumble. The city is a place of incredible contrast. You might see a wealthy merchant riding in a sedan chair, carried by 4 servants, while a starving beggar lies in the alley beside him. You might find a shop selling exquisite jade carvings right next to a butcher's stall. The class divisions are sharp and visible everywhere you look. But for all its dangers and discomforts, the city offers one thing the countryside can't: opportunity. You're not stuck with the same fate as your father and his father before him. You might be a blacksmith's apprentice today, but with a bit of luck and a lot of hard work, you could open your own shop one day. The city is a gamble, but for many, it's a gamble worth taking. But let's be honest, for the vast majority of the population, the city was a fantasy. Their lives were spent in the dirt, under the sun, a rhythm of existence that had changed little in 1,000 years. You're about to leave the city and return to the countryside, to face the very real and very physical challenges of being a common farmer. It's a different kind of hardship, but no less demanding, and it's the life that truly powered this massive empire. You've left the crowded, noisy streets of the Han city behind and are now back in the quiet, green expanse of the countryside. This is the reality for the vast majority of people in Imperial China. The silent, foundational layer of society that made everything else possible. You are a farmer, and your life is a relentless cycle of planting and harvesting. This is the agricultural grind, a mainstream historical fact that your existence is entirely dependent on the seasons, the weather, and the whims of a handful of officials. Your greatest fear isn't a roving bandit, but a flood or a drought. Events that can wipe out your entire year's labor in a matter of days. You wake with the sun and work until it sets, your hands calloused, your back aching, and your mind perpetually on the state of your crops. Your small plot of land is your entire world. You work it with a simple iron hoe, a tool that hasn't changed much in generations. The grain you grow, millet in the north, rice in the south, isn't just food, it's also your tax payment. The state demands its due, and it always comes first. You're constantly worried about having enough left over for your family after you've paid the tax collectors. It's a life of scarcity and hard choices. Do you sell the last of your silk to buy a new tool, or do you keep it to make a new robe for your son? These are the real-life dilemmas that occupy your mind. Here's a quirky tidbit about farming in ancient China. Farmers would often use sophisticated irrigation techniques, like the chain pump, to move water from a lower source to their fields. This wasn't a simple bucket and rope system. It was an ingenious machine powered by a foot pedal, a bit like a bicycle. One person could pedal for hours, and the pump would lift a continuous stream of water. It was a simple technology, but it was a lifesaver in a drought, and it showed a level of agricultural ingenuity that was far ahead of many other parts of the world. It's also an exhausting, mind-numbing task that you have to do every day during the dry season. Historians still argue whether the Chinese government's focus on land-based taxation was a clever and efficient way to manage a large agrarian society, or if it was a system that inevitably led to peasant poverty and rebellion. You can see both sides. When the harvest is good, you're grateful for the stability the system provides, but when the harvest fails, you're left with nothing, and the officials still come to collect their due. And when that happens, a peasant uprising, which you've seen before, starts to look less like a distant possibility and more like a very real and very tempting option. But for now, there's a different kind of opportunity. A group of merchants has arrived in your village looking for help. They're on their way to the west, to a place you've only heard of in whispers, the Silk Road. They need labourers to help them carry their goods over the mountains and through the deserts. The pay is good, and the promise of adventure is even better. It's a chance to escape the endless cycle of the farm, but it's a dangerous one. You've heard stories of bandits, sandstorms, and treacherous mountain passes. But the thought of a new life, one that isn't tied to the dirt and the seasons, is too tempting to resist. You're about to leave the farm behind and become a part of the most famous trade route in history. A long and perilous journey that could make you rich or end your life in the middle of a desert. You've made your decision. The endless cycle of the farm is a known misery, but the potential rewards of the Silk Road are too tempting to ignore. You've joined a caravan, a slow-moving train of camels and merchants, and you're now on the journey of a lifetime. This is the perilous journey of a merchant on the treacherous Silk Road, a mainstream historical fact that few people outside of this trade ever truly understood. The road isn't a single path, it's a network of trails, oases, and mountain passes that stretched for thousands of miles, connecting the Han capital to the distant Roman Empire. Your job is to help carry the goods, bales of silk, spices, and ceramics that are worth more than your entire village. It's a dangerous job, but the pay could set your family up for generations. The dangers are immediate and very real. First, there are the natural elements. You trudge through arid deserts where the wind whips up sandstorms that can bury you in minutes. The sun is a relentless hammer, and the nights are bone-chillingly cold. You must constantly be on guard for water. A single wrong turn can mean certain death. Then there are the bandits. They aren't just outlaws. They're often highly organized groups who know the terrain better than anyone and see your caravan as a moving treasure chest. You're a soft target, and the merchants you work for are heavily armed. But you know that a skirmish could end in a heartbeat. You have to sleep with one eye open, always listening for the slightest sound in the silent desert night. Here's a quirky tidbit about the Silk Road that goes beyond the obvious dangers. One of the most important jobs in a caravan wasn't a guard or a camel driver, but a water diviner, or someone who could find hidden springs and underground water sources. These were often people who had a reputation for having a sixth sense about the land, a kind of desert witch or wise man whose knowledge was more valuable than gold. A caravan would pay a fortune for such a person's services, because a mistake could mean the death of the entire party. So, while you're busy fending off sandflies, someone else is listening to the earth, trying to hear the whisper of water in a vast, silent landscape. Historians still argue whether the Silk Road was a primary route for large-scale trade, or if it was mainly a channel for the exchange of ideas, technologies, and culture. While a few major goods like silk and porcelain did travel along it, many of the items were high-value, low-volume goods. The true impact might have been the exchange of things like Buddhism, papermaking, and disease. From your perspective, you don't care about the exchange of ideas, you just want to get to the next oasis without being robbed or dying of thirst. The idea of culture is a luxury you can't afford right now. Your journey ends at a trading post at the edge of the empire. You've made it, battered but alive. You're paid for your services. And the amount of money you have is more than you could have earned in 10 years on the farm. You're no longer a simple peasant. You're a man who has stared into the face of death and won. But you've also seen the incredible wealth that flows into the empire from these far-flung lands. You've tasted the opulence of the merchant class, a world away from your simple existence. This journey has given you a glimpse into a world of incredible wealth and grinding poverty, a world of imperial banquets and the threat of famine. You've seen the riches that flow from the outside world, and now you're about to experience what that wealth looks like on the inside, in the stark contrast between the imperial feasting halls and the empty stomachs of the common people. You're about to go from a place of immense scarcity to one of incredible excess, a sudden and jarring change that will show you the true face of power. You've returned from the treacherous journey on the Silk Road, your pockets heavier than they've ever been, and a new perspective on the world. You've seen the incredible wealth that a few people possess, and now you're about to witness it firsthand. You're no longer just a spectator, you're a part of the grand spectacle of the Han dynasty's capital. A city where the opulence of the court stands in jarring contrast to the poverty of the common people. This is the world of feasting and famine, a mainstream historical fact that highlights the deep and often brutal class divisions in imperial China. Imagine you're an outsider, perhaps a servant or a low-level supplier, at a grand imperial banquet. The air is thick with the scent of roasted duck, spiced meats, and exotic fruits that you've never seen before. The silk robes of the attendees shimmer under the lamplight. Musicians play melodic tunes on zithers and flutes. The dishes are served in exquisite porcelain bowls and jade plates. There's so much food that you can't even imagine eating it all. The emperor sits at the head of the table, surrounded by his ministers and favoured guests, a picture of power and plenty. This is a feast, a performance of wealth and success, a celebration of the empire's ability to extract and consume. It's a world where a single meal can contain more value than a common farmer earns in a year. Meanwhile, just outside the city walls, the truth is very different. You hear whispers of a bad harvest in a distant province. The rivers have flooded, and the crops have failed. People are starving. The very food that you see on the banquet table is a stark reminder of the hunger that many people are facing. You see families begging in the streets, their clothes ragged, their faces gaunt. They're not victims of a sudden disaster. They're victims of a system that prioritizes the consumption of the powerful over the survival of the masses. Here's a quirky tidbit that demonstrates this chasm during times of famine. The emperor would often issue an edict to open the imperial granaries. This sounds compassionate, right? But the reality was that the food often didn't get to the people who needed it most. Corrupt officials would steal the grain, or it would be sold at exorbitant prices to the very people who were starving. The edict was often a public relations move, a way for the emperor to prove he still had the mandate of heaven, even if the reality on the ground was far from perfect. It's a bit like a modern corporation tweeting about a charity event while its employees are struggling to make ends meet. Historians still argue whether the Han dynasty's economic policies were a benefit to the common people, or if they were designed to consolidate power and wealth in the hands of the elite. While the Silk Road brought in new wealth and goods, it also widened the gap between the rich and the poor. You can't help but feel a sense of unease. The money you earned on your journey is a luxury, but it doesn't change the fundamental injustice of the world around you. You're a witness to a great historical drama, a moment in time when the empire is at the height of its power, but also teetering on the edge of a great social collapse. You've seen the beautiful silks and the rare spices, but you've also seen the hungry faces in the streets. The Han dynasty, for all its glory, eventually fell, not from an outside invasion, but from within. A series of peasant rebellions, fueled by the very hunger you witnessed, brought the empire to its knees, but from its ashes would rise a new era, a time of artistic and cultural flourishing that would be known as the Golden Age. You're about to transition from the practical, pragmatic Han dynasty to the more artistic and cosmopolitan Tang dynasty. The focus will shift from bureaucracy and trade to poetry and politics. A subtle but significant change that will once again reshape your world. The Han dynasty has faded into the history books, and you've endured a long period of disunity and chaos. But now, you are standing at the dawn of the Tang dynasty, a new and glorious era often called China's Golden Age. This is a mainstream historical fact that you can see, hear, and feel all around you. The previous era was about consolidation and bureaucracy. This one is about art, culture, and a level of cosmopolitanism that you've never experienced. The capital city of Chang'an, modern-day Xi'an, is a place of wonder, a city of over 1 million people, and a true melting pot of cultures. You're no longer just surrounded by other Chinese people. You see merchants from Persia, monks from India, and performers from Central Asia. The streets are a cacophony of languages and a rainbow of exotic fabrics. This is a far cry from the cramped, dirty hutongs you remember. The Tang dynasty, unlike its predecessors, was open to the outside world. This created a vibrant and exciting atmosphere. The Silk Road, which you once navigated in fear, is now a bustling highway of commerce and ideas. New religions, like Buddhism and Nestorian Christianity, are tolerated, and their temples and monasteries are a common sight. You can buy spices from India, glass from the Middle East, and even taste a new kind of bread from the West. The court is a patron of the arts, and the poetry of Li Bai and Du Fu is on everyone's lips. It's a time of optimism, a feeling that the world is a big, fascinating place, and that the Chinese Empire is at its very center. Here's a quirky tidbit about the Tang dynasty's openness. There were entire districts in the capital dedicated to foreign traders and residents. These communities had their own customs and even their own legal systems. So long as they didn't violate Tang law, it was a way of welcoming foreign wealth and talent without completely disrupting the local social order. It's a bit like a modern-day embassy district, but with way more camels and exotic smells. This level of tolerance was remarkable and helped create a cultural boom that would last for centuries. Historians still argue whether the Tang's cosmopolitanism was a sign of true tolerance or if it was simply a byproduct of the empire's immense economic and military power. Did they welcome foreigners because they genuinely believed in a universal brotherhood, or did they just see them as a way to enrich the empire and impress other nations? From your perspective, you don't care about the political philosophy behind it. You're just happy to be a part of this vibrant, colourful world where there's always something new to see and do. You're no longer just a farmer or a merchant, you're a citizen of a global empire. But this isn't all about trade and spices. The Tang dynasty's greatest legacy, besides its stunning poetry, is the way it intertwined art and politics. The next thing you're going to discover is that in this era, a beautiful poem isn't just a poem, it's a political statement, a career move, and sometimes a matter of life and death. The emperor himself is a poet, and the highest officials are expected to be masters of verse. The pen, you will find, is not just a tool for bureaucracy, it's a weapon in the deadly game of court intrigue. Your world is about to become a lot more beautiful and a lot more dangerous. You've seen the vibrancy of the Tang capital, and now you're about to understand its beating heart, the intricate dance of poetry and politics. In this era, a person's ability to compose a beautiful poem wasn't just a pleasant pastime, it was a crucial part of their identity and their political career. This is a mainstream historical fact that makes the Tang dynasty unique. The imperial court wasn't just filled with administrators, it was a gathering of some of the greatest poets in Chinese history. A perfectly crafted verse could win you favor with the emperor, secure a promotion, or even save your life. A poorly composed one could lead to a social faux pas that would ruin your reputation forever. You might be at a banquet, or a simple gathering, and a high-ranking official challenges you to compose a poem on the spot, perhaps about the moon or a departing friend. The entire room holds its breath. You can't just say no. Your reputation and your future depends on your response. The ability to quickly and elegantly compose a poem was a sign of a sharp mind, a refined spirit, and a deep understanding of the Confucian classics, all the qualities a ruler would want in his officials. It was a skill that was practiced from a young age, as important as learning to read and write. It's a bit like a modern-day business executive being judged on their ability to deliver a perfect, impromptu Shakespearean monologue. Here's a quirky tidbit about this poetic culture. Poets were known to carry small, lightweight notebooks with them everywhere they went, ready to jot down a flash of inspiration. There are stories of poets stopping their boats in the middle of a river or interrupting a meal to capture a perfect line of verse. They weren't just writing for themselves, they were writing for an audience of their peers, a community of scholars who would read, critique, and immortalize their work. Their fame could spread across the empire based on a single, brilliant poem. It's a far cry from a simple social media post. This was the original form of viral content, only it was carried by hand on scrolls and memorized by thousands. Historians still argue whether the Tang dynasty's emphasis on poetry and the arts led to a more compassionate and effective government, or if it simply created a class of officials who were more concerned with their own artistic reputations than with the well-being of the common people. Did the love of beauty distract them from the nitty-gritty of governance, or did it make them better leaders by fostering a more well-rounded and empathetic perspective? You might ponder this as you hear a beggar singing a popular poem for a few coins in a bustling market. The same art that elevates the elite can also be a source of solace and entertainment for the poor. But all of this refined art and culture comes with a very real, very present danger. The court is a place of intrigue, and a single wrong word or a misplaced gesture can have disastrous consequences. Your life is no longer just about survival, it's about navigating a world of subtle social cues, hidden meanings, and unspoken rivalries. The next challenge you're about to face is a masterclass in diplomacy, deception, and the deadly game of palace politics. You're no longer just a spectator, you're now standing in the very heart of the empire, where a simple smile can mean 1,000 different things. You're standing in the hallowed halls of the imperial palace, and the air is thick with a different kind of tension than you've ever felt. It's not the fear of a whip or the exhaustion of hard labor. It's the subtle, psychological pressure of court etiquette and peril. This is a mainstream historical fact that you learn very quickly. In the imperial court, your life is governed by a strict set of rules, and a single misstep can be fatal. The smallest gesture, a slight bow, or a carefully chosen phrase can be a matter of life and death. The emperor is the sun, and you must orient yourself to him at all times, never turning your back on him, never speaking out of turn, and always addressing him with the utmost respect. Every interaction is a performance. You must know when to speak and when to remain silent. You must know how to interpret the emperor's mood from the subtlest change in his expression. You are always watching, always calculating, always on guard. Your rivals, your so-called allies, are doing the exact same thing. A word of praise to one official could be seen as an insult to another. A gift given to the wrong person could be interpreted as a political alliance. It's a deadly dance of social cues, and you are constantly on your toes, trying to keep from tripping. Here's a quirky tidbit that will give you a sense of this social minefield. When a high-ranking official was granted an audience with the emperor, he was often given a ceremonial fan or a tablet, and he was expected to hold it in a specific way. If he held it too low, it could be seen as a sign of disrespect. If he held it too high, it could be seen as a challenge to the emperor's authority. It was a seemingly simple action, but it was loaded with meaning. It's a bit like a modern business meeting where a handshake can either seal a deal or a sign of a hostile takeover, only with a lot more silk and a lot more at stake. Historians still argue whether the intense formality of the Chinese court was a necessary way to maintain order and stability, or if it was a system designed to create an environment of fear and paranoia that would make it impossible for anyone to challenge the emperor's power. You might think it's a bit of both. The strict rules did prevent a lot of outright brawling and open rebellion, but they also made it impossible to have a truly honest and open conversation. You can see how a good emperor could use this system for the good of the empire, and how a bad emperor could use it to destroy his rivals. Now, let's turn our attention to a very different kind of social pressure, one that you would see in every home, every village, and every city. While the men were locked in the deadly dance of court intrigue, the women were often subjected to a different kind of ritual, one that was both a sign of beauty and a source of immense physical pain. We're about to talk about a practice that would come to define the lives of millions of women for centuries, a tradition that was both an art form and a crippling form of social control. You're about to be introduced to the practice of foot binding, a tradition that you will find both fascinating and horrifying. You've survived the social minefield of the Tang court, but now you're about to witness a very different kind of societal pressure. This one, unlike court intrigue, wasn't confined to the halls of power but permeated every level of society, a ritual of beauty and pain. We're talking about foot binding, a practice that would come to define the lives of millions of women for over 1,000 years. While it may have roots in the Tang dynasty, it became a widespread mainstream historical fact during the Song dynasty and after. The process began in a girl's early childhood, usually between the ages of 4 and 9. Her feet were wrapped tightly with long strips of cloth, forcing her toes to curl under the sole, breaking the arch, and compressing the bones. The goal was to create a lotus foot, a tiny, 4-inch long foot that was considered the height of feminine beauty and a symbol of high social status. The reality was far from beautiful. The process was agonizingly painful, often leading to infections, gangrene, and lifelong disability. A woman with bound feet could not walk easily or far. She was, in essence, confined to her home, her mobility a direct reflection of her husband's wealth. A wealthy man's wife wouldn't need to work in the fields or even walk to the market. Her bound feet were a public display of her husband's ability to support her. It was a crippling act of love, a paradox of beauty and confinement. Here's a quirky tidbit about the practice. Not all women had bound feet. The practice was primarily common among the Han Chinese elite and upper classes. Peasants and women from ethnic minority groups, like the Manchu, often did not bind their feet because they needed to be mobile to work. So, you could tell a woman's social standing just by looking at her feet. It was a visible, and often painful, status symbol. It's a bit like a modern-day luxury car, but with way more suffering and a much higher chance of you needing a cane later in life. Historians still argue whether foot-binding was a form of patriarchal oppression or if it was a cultural practice that was willingly embraced by women as a way to improve their social standing and marriage prospects. You can see both sides. While the practice was undoubtedly a form of social control, limiting a woman's mobility and independence, women who didn't bind their feet were often seen as less marriageable. So, for many, it was a choice, albeit a deeply constrained one. As the Tang dynasty faded and the Song dynasty began, you'll see that the world of foot-binding was a stark contrast to the period's incredible technological advancements. While some people were being confined to their homes, others were inventing things that would change the world forever. You're about to witness a shift from the cultural brilliance of the Tang to the scientific and commercial brilliance of the Song dynasty. The focus will change from poetry and politics to gunpowder, printing, and a new kind of urban life. The pen is still mighty, but the compass, the banknote, and the printing block are about to become even mightier. You've seen the cultural splendor of the Tang and the pain of its social customs, but now you're entering the Song dynasty, a new era defined by a surge of technological innovation and commercial growth. This is a mainstream historical fact that many people don't know. The Song dynasty was a period of scientific and technological revolution, a time when China was arguably the most advanced civilization on Earth. While the rest of the world was still living in the Dark Ages, the Chinese were inventing things that would change the course of human history. The Song dynasty was a technological powerhouse, a fact that would be all too relevant to the future of the world. Imagine you're walking through a Song-era city. You might see a shopkeeper using a new kind of paper money, a currency note that could replace heavy coins and make commerce much easier. You might see a man holding a primitive compass, a magnetized needle floating in water, using it to navigate on a cloudy day, and you might hear a distant explosion. That would be the sound of gunpowder, a substance that was first used for fireworks and signaling but would soon be a devastating weapon of war. These are not just fun little inventions, they are the seeds of a global transformation. The fact that the Chinese were using movable type printing centuries before Gutenberg in Europe is a stunning example of their ingenuity. Here's a quirky tidbit about Song dynasty technology. They had a sophisticated machine called a suction pump, which was used for everything from dredging canals to extinguishing fires. It was a clever device that was so effective that it was still being used in some parts of China hundreds of years later. It's a bit like finding an ancient Roman iPhone that still works. This wasn't a society that was just building on old ideas, they were creating entirely new ones. Historians still argue whether this technological boom was a result of the Song dynasty's political instability, which forced them to innovate in order to defend themselves, or if it was a natural result of the era's commercialization and urbanization. You can see both sides. The constant threat of nomadic invaders certainly pushed the Chinese to develop better weapons. But the rise of a new merchant class and the growth of cities also created a demand for new technologies and luxuries. But for all its technological prowess, the Song dynasty was still at the mercy of its geography. A vast empire needed a way to move goods and people from one end to the other. And the Song dynasty had a solution that was a masterpiece of human engineering. You're about to travel on the Grand Canal, a man-made river that connected the north and the south, a feat of engineering that would make any modern-day engineer gasp in awe. It was a project that was as impressive as the Great Wall, but it was built for commerce, not for war. You're about to leave the world of inventors and enter a world of water, a world where the power of the empire flows on a man-made river. You've marveled at the Song dynasty's inventions, but now you're about to see a masterpiece of engineering that brought it all together. You are standing on the banks of the Grand Canal, a man-made river that is the lifeblood of the empire. This is a mainstream historical fact that few truly grasp. This canal, which stretches for over 1,000 miles, connecting the north and south of China, wasn't built in a day. It was built over centuries, with different parts constructed by different dynasties, a testament to a long-standing need for efficient transportation. But it was during the Song that it became the bustling commercial artery that it is today. You're about to become a part of its endless, flowing life. The canal is an incredible sight. It's wide enough for 2 barges to pass each other with ease, and its banks are lined with willow trees. The air is filled with the calls of boatmen, the creak of wooden oars, and the laughter of people who live their entire lives on the water. The canal is not just a highway for goods, it's a floating city. You see barges piled high with grain from the fertile south, and others carrying porcelain and silk to the markets of the north. This is the very essence of the Song dynasty's commercial revolution. The canal makes it possible to feed a massive urban population and to transport goods from one end of the empire to the other, making a unified, prosperous China possible. Here's a quirky tidbit about the Grand Canal. It wasn't just a simple ditch, it was a sophisticated system of locks, a technology that was hundreds of years ahead of its time. These locks, essentially water elevators, allowed boats to be raised and lowered to different water levels, allowing them to navigate different terrains and altitudes. Without them, the canal would have been useless in many places. It's a bit like a modern-day freight train system that uses a network of intricate, custom-built bridges to cross mountains. The Chinese understood the power of water, and they had the ingenuity to control it. Historians still argue whether the Grand Canal was a net benefit to the people, or if it was a project that was built on the backs of forced labour and caused immense suffering. While it did create a new merchant class and bring prosperity to many regions, the human cost of its construction was staggering. You might think about this as you see a team of men pulling a heavy barge up a steep incline. The prosperity you see is built on a foundation of sweat and misery. For all its wonders, the Song dynasty, like all dynasties before it, was not immune to outside threats. You've seen the wealth and ingenuity of this era, but you're about to be confronted with a new kind of power, one that doesn't rely on technological innovation or bureaucratic efficiency. It relies on the sword, the horse, and a terrifying kind of unity. You're about to see the empire's brilliant light dimmed by a force from the north, a force that will change the face of China forever. You're about to witness the beginning of the Mongol invasion, a storm of human fury that will sweep across the continent and leave a trail of destruction in its wake. You've heard the whispers, seen the fear in people's eyes. The name on everyone's lips is Mongol. You're now witnessing the start of the terrifying and swift Mongol invasion, a mainstream historical fact that completely changed the course of Chinese history, unlike the invaders of the past, who were often settled farmers or rival dynasties. The Mongols are a force of nature. They are nomadic horsemen from the northern steppes, masters of the bow and the mounted charge. Their leader, Kublai Khan, is the grandson of the legendary Genghis Khan, a name that sends shivers down the spine of every person in the empire. Their tactics are brutal and efficient. They don't fight like the Chinese armies you're used to. They use feigned retreats, psychological warfare, and overwhelming speed. Their horses are smaller and more resilient than the Chinese war horses, and they can cover vast distances in a single day. The Chinese military, used to fighting on foot and in fixed formations, is completely outmatched. You hear stories of entire cities being razed to the ground, their populations put to the sword. The Mongol army isn't just an army, it's a conquering wave, a force that doesn't just want to win a battle, but to utterly annihilate its enemies. You're no longer worried about a corrupt official or a bad harvest, you're worried about your very existence. Here's a quirky tidbit about the Mongol army that you might find fascinating, if a bit terrifying. They were masters of using a kind of portable siege engine, which they could assemble quickly and use to break down the walls of fortified cities. While the Chinese had impressive siege technology, the Mongols had a practical, efficient, and, most importantly, mobile version. It's a bit like a modern-day special forces team that can drop a prefabricated bomb shelter and an explosive device in the middle of a city, only way more terrifying. They didn't play by the rules, they made their own. Historians still argue whether the Mongol invasion was a necessary evil that unified China after a period of division, or if it was a devastating setback that destroyed centuries of cultural and technological progress. You can see both sides. On the one hand, their brutal conquest brought a unified, if foreign, rule to a fragmented China. On the other hand, the human cost was staggering, and the destruction of cities, libraries, and ancient texts was a cultural catastrophe. From your perspective, you're not concerned with the long-term historical consequences, you're just trying to survive. You've managed to escape the path of the main Mongol army, but your world is no longer what it was. The Song dynasty is in ruins, and a new, foreign dynasty has taken its place. You are about to live under the rule of the Mongols, in a dynasty that they will call the Yuan, and you will find that their rule is a completely different kind of challenge. They are not interested in the Confucian classics, the mandate of heaven, or the intricacies of the civil service. They are interested in control, taxation, and a completely different way of life. You're about to become a citizen in an empire that stretches from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe, but you're no longer in a truly Chinese world. The dust of the Mongol conquest has settled, and you're now living under the rule of the Yuan dynasty. This is a crucial mainstream historical fact. For the first time in centuries, China is not ruled by a Han Chinese emperor, but by a foreign, nomadic people. The capital is no longer the grand city of Chang'an, but a new, gleaming city called Dadu, built by the Mongols on the site of what is now modern-day Beijing. The new rulers, led by Kublai Khan, govern with a distinct and foreign style, one that you'll find both pragmatic and alienating. They are more interested in trade and military power than in the intricacies of Confucian philosophy. The first thing you notice is the social hierarchy. The Mongols have established a four-tier system, and you, as a Han Chinese, are on the bottom of it. At the top are the Mongols, the ruling elite. Below them are the Semu, a category of people from Central and Western Asia who are given special privileges because of their usefulness to the empire. Below them are the Northern Chinese, who had surrendered to the Mongols earlier, and at the very bottom are the Southern Chinese, like you, who resisted the longest. This system is not just symbolic, it's a very real part of your daily life. You have to endure discrimination in the courts and are often subjected to heavier taxes and stricter punishments. It's a bitter pill to swallow after centuries of being at the center of the civilized world. Here's a quirky tidbit about the Yuan dynasty's approach to governance. The Mongols, who didn't trust the Han Chinese civil service, often relied on foreigners, like the Semu, to run the bureaucracy. This is how the famous Venetian merchant Marco Polo was able to find a position in Kublai Khan's court. Imagine a government run by people who are complete outsiders, with no understanding of your language or your customs. It's a frustrating, often comical, and occasionally dangerous situation. They might not understand a subtle insult or a polite refusal, and their directness can feel like a slap in the face. It's a bit like a modern-day company being run by people from a completely different cultural background, only with way more power and a much higher chance of you being executed for a misunderstanding. Historians still argue whether the Yuan dynasty was a period of cultural stagnation or a time of vibrant exchange. On one hand, the Mongols did not value the traditional civil service exam system, which meant that many scholars were left without positions, and the arts and literature of the era were not as celebrated as they were in previous dynasties. On the other hand, the vast Mongol Empire, the largest in human history, created a new kind of Pax Mongolica, a period of relative peace and safety that allowed for a massive exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies between Asia and Europe. You can see both sides. While your life is harder, you're also seeing new foods, new music, and new technologies from all over the world. But this foreign rule, for all its innovations, was not destined to last. A combination of economic mismanagement, natural disasters, and the growing resentment of the Han Chinese led to a series of rebellions. The Mongols, who were excellent conquerors, were not as good at governing a massive, complex empire. You're about to witness the end of the Yuan dynasty and the beginning of a new era, one that will see the return of Han Chinese rule and a renewed focus on the traditions of the past. You're about to see the rise of the Ming dynasty, a new kind of empire, one that will build a wall not just of stone, but of tradition and culture. The foreign rule of the Yuan dynasty has ended, and you're now witnessing the return of Han Chinese power with the rise of the Ming dynasty. This is a mainstream historical fact that you feel in your bones. The empire is Chinese again. The Ming, led by the peasant-turned-emperor Hongwu, came to power on a wave of popular resentment against the Mongols. Their rule is a conscious effort to restore traditional Chinese culture and systems that were neglected or outright rejected by the Yuan. This is a time of cultural revival, of going back to the old ways, but with a new, defensive mindset. The empire has been humiliated, and it is determined to never let it happen again. The first thing you notice is the renewed emphasis on Confucianism and the civil service exams. The examination system, which had fallen into disuse under the Mongols, is now the only path to power. You see young men, like the scholar from Section 6, once again poring over the classics, their futures tied to their ability to write a perfect essay. The Ming dynasty is a return to a familiar world, one where the scholar, not the warrior, is at the top of the social hierarchy. But there's a new element of paranoia. The Ming emperors are often paranoid about conspiracies and disloyalty, and they rule with a more centralized, and often brutal, style than their Han or Tang predecessors. Here's a quirky tidbit about the Ming dynasty's return to tradition. The first Ming emperor, Hongwu, was a peasant who had a deep distrust of the educated elite. He abolished the position of prime minister and took all of the power for himself, creating a centralized government that was unprecedented in Chinese history. He also established a network of secret police, known as the Embroidered Uniform Guard, who could arrest and torture anyone suspected of disloyalty. So, while the civil service exam was a return to tradition, the way the government was run was a radical departure. It's a bit like a modern-day CEO who decides to do away with the entire C-suite and personally handle every single decision, but with way more torture. Historians still argue whether the Ming dynasty's focus on tradition and centralization was a brilliant way to restore order after the chaos of the Yuan, or if it was a system that ultimately made the empire stagnant and unable to adapt to new challenges. You can see both sides. The return to the old ways did bring stability and a sense of cultural pride, but it also made the empire less open to new ideas and technologies from the outside world. But for all its focus on the past, the Ming dynasty was also a period of grand, almost unimaginable construction. The Mongols had built a new capital, and the Ming emperor would take it to a new level, creating a city that was a fortress and a palace all at once. You're about to be introduced to the most famous building in all of China, a place of immense power and mystery. You're about to stand before the impenetrable walls of the emperor's private and powerful domain, a place that you will only ever know from the outside. You're about to enter the world of the Forbidden City. You've seen the rise of the Ming, and now you're standing before the walls of their greatest achievement, the Forbidden City. This is a mainstream historical fact that is impossible to ignore. This isn't just a palace, it's a city within a city, a labyrinth of halls, courtyards, and gardens that is utterly off limits to you and every other common person. It is a symbol of the emperor's absolute power and his divine separation from his subjects. You can't even get close to the gates without a valid reason, and even then, you'd be stopped by a legion of guards. Its sheer scale is overwhelming. The red walls stretch for miles, the golden roofs glinting in the sun, a silent, imposing testament to the power of the Son of Heaven. Inside, it's a world of its own, a meticulously planned universe where everything has a purpose and every person has their place. The main halls are reserved for grand ceremonies and political gatherings. The inner courts are where the emperor and his thousands of concubines, servants, and eunuchs live. The entire city is built on a north-south axis, a symbolic connection between the emperor and the heavens. It's a physical manifestation of the mandate of heaven, a place where the earthly ruler lives in a cosmic order. Here's a quirky tidbit about the Forbidden City that will give you a sense of its meticulous design. Every single roof tile on the main buildings is a specific shade of golden yellow, a color that was reserved for the emperor. No other person in the empire was allowed to use this color. It was a subtle, but powerful, way of reinforcing the emperor's unique status. It's a bit like a modern-day brand that has a color so iconic that no one else can use it, but with way more social and political consequences if you get it wrong. Historians still argue whether the Forbidden City was a necessary fortress to protect the emperor from his enemies, both foreign and domestic, or if it was a decadent project that wasted the empire's resources and isolated the emperor from his people. You can see both sides. The city did provide a sense of security, but it also created an environment where the emperor was completely cut off from reality. He had to rely on a few trusted advisors. And as you'll soon find out, those advisors were often not what they seemed. The most powerful and feared of these advisors were the eunuchs. They were not just servants. They were a class of men who held immense power within the Forbidden City. They were the emperor's eyes and ears, and they controlled every aspect of his daily life. You're about to learn about the strange and powerful world of the eunuchs, men who had to sacrifice everything for a chance at power. You've seen the imposing walls of the Forbidden City, but now you're about to be introduced to the strange and powerful men who lived inside them. We're talking about the eunuchs, a class of men who, by virtue of their castration, were able to serve the emperor and his harem without the risk of creating a rival bloodline. This is a mainstream historical fact that few people grasp in its full complexity. They weren't just servants, they were a unique and often feared class of men who held immense power behind the scenes, a kind of shadow government that was more influential than the official civil service. They were the emperor's eyes and ears, his trusted advisors, and sometimes his ultimate downfall. A young boy, often from a poor family, would be castrated as a child in the hopes that he would one day find a position in the Forbidden City. The procedure was brutal and unsanitary, and many died from infection. But for those who survived, the reward was a life of luxury and power that was unimaginable to a commoner. They started at the bottom, performing menial tasks like sweeping floors and carrying water, but they could rise through the ranks to become the emperor's personal confidant, a powerful minister, or even a military commander. They were the gatekeepers, controlling who saw the emperor and what information reached his ears. Their power was entirely dependent on their proximity to the throne. Here's a quirky tidbit about the power of the eunuchs, because they were often the only people who could move freely between the emperor's private quarters and the public courts. They became masters of information. They knew who was in favor, who was out of favor, and who was plotting against whom. They could use this knowledge to enrich themselves, to destroy their rivals, and to influence imperial decisions. It's a bit like a modern-day chief of staff who also happens to be a master of social media gossip and back-channel deals. Only way more dangerous and with way more silk robes. Historians still argue whether the eunuchs were a necessary evil to protect the imperial bloodline, or if they were a corrupting influence that ultimately led to the Ming dynasty's decline. You can see both sides. On the one hand, they were fiercely loyal to the emperor, because their power was tied directly to his. On the other hand, their power was often a direct threat to the power of the civil service and the legitimate government. They were a parallel power structure that was often at war with the rest of the bureaucracy. The eunuch's power was an open secret and a constant source of tension. Now, let's turn our attention to a very different kind of journey. One that was not taken by a eunuch or a scholar, but by a man who was also a eunuch. You're about to witness one of the most incredible events in human history. A series of naval expeditions that would dwarf anything the West would accomplish for centuries. You're about to be introduced to the great fleet of Zheng He, a man who sailed for the emperor and created a map of the world that was bigger than anyone had ever imagined. The intricate web of the eunuch's power has given you a new understanding of court life, but now you're about to see their influence on a truly grand scale. One of the most famous eunuchs, Zheng He, was a naval admiral who led a series of massive expeditions across the Indian Ocean. This is a mainstream historical fact that is often overlooked in Western history, but it was a staggering display of Ming dynasty power and wealth from 1405 to 1433. Zheng He commanded a fleet of hundreds of massive treasure ships and tens of thousands of sailors, venturing as far as the coast of East Africa. The sheer scale of these expeditions is breathtaking. The treasure ships, which were the largest wooden ships ever built, were over 400 feet long and had 9 masts. They were floating cities, complete with gardens, fresh water, and a crew of thousands. They weren't built for conquest or colonization. They were built to project Ming power and to collect tribute from foreign kings. The fleet would sail into a port, and the local ruler would be so awed by its size and wealth that he would agree to pay tribute to the Chinese emperor. Zheng He would then return with a cargo of exotic animals, spices, and precious stones, a physical manifestation of the emperor's cosmic power. Here's a quirky tidbit about Zheng He's expeditions. He brought back a giraffe from Africa, a creature that the Chinese had never seen before. The giraffe was so strange and beautiful that the emperor's court decided it must be the mythical Qilin, a benevolent creature from Chinese mythology that only appears during the reign of a virtuous ruler. It was a great piece of propaganda for the emperor, a way of proving he still had the mandate of heaven. It's a bit like a modern-day politician getting a blessing from a mythical creature that only appears once every 1,000 years, only with way more spots and a much longer neck. Historians still argue whether these voyages were a success or a massive waste of resources. While they did bring back wealth and prestige, they were incredibly expensive to maintain. After Zheng He's death, the voyages were abruptly ended, and the massive treasure ships were allowed to rot in the harbors. The Ming dynasty turned inward, a decision that would have long-term consequences for China's relationship with the rest of the world. Now, let's step away from the grand scale of imperial power and focus on a much smaller, but no less important, world. While the eunuchs and admirals were navigating the seas and the political currents of the court, A different kind of life was being lived by the intellectual elite. You're about to enter the quiet, contemplative world of a scholar, a man who lives his life surrounded by books, art, and intellectual pursuits. You're about to see a very different kind of power, one that comes from the mind, not the sword. You've seen the grandeur of the imperial fleet, but now you're about to enter a world that is its complete opposite, the quiet, contemplative world of the scholar. You are in a scholar's study, a mainstream historical fact that shows a different kind of power in imperial China. This isn't a place of vast armies or political intrigue. It's a small, private universe, a room filled with books, paintings, and the four treasures of the study: the inkstone, the ink stick, the paper, and the brush. The scholar is not a warrior or an official. He is a man of letters, a man who has devoted his life to the pursuit of knowledge and art. The scholar's study is a sanctuary, a place where he can escape the noise and chaos of the outside world. He spends his days reading the classics, composing poetry, and practicing calligraphy. His life is a quiet pursuit of excellence, a never-ending journey to master the arts of his culture. He might be an official, but his true life is here, among his books. He is a member of the gentry, the educated elite who ran the day-to-day business of the empire. He is a gentleman, a person who values culture and refinement above all else. His power comes not from his title, but from his knowledge and his moral authority. Here's a quirky tidbit about the scholar's life. They were often obsessed with collecting strange and beautiful objects, from oddly shaped rocks to miniature trees. These objects were not just for decoration, they were meant to inspire contemplation and to connect the scholar with the natural world. A scholar might spend a fortune on a single, perfectly balanced rock, believing that its natural beauty was a reflection of the cosmic order. It's a bit like a modern-day art collector who buys a single, bizarre sculpture for their office, only with way more spiritual meaning and a much higher chance of you just thinking it's a weird rock. Historians still argue whether the scholar class was a force for good in Chinese society, or if they were a self-serving elite who were more concerned with their own status than with the well-being of the common people. You can see both sides. On the one hand, they were the custodians of Chinese culture and the intellectual engines of the empire. On the other hand, they were often landowners who exploited the peasants on their land and used their positions to get ahead. The scholar's study is just one part of the world of the gentry. Now, you're about to see the rest of their world. You're about to leave the quiet study and enter the home of a wealthy family, a place of immense privilege and intricate social rules. You're about to experience what it's like to live a life of comfort, surrounded by servants and luxury. A life that is a world away from the dusty fields of the common farmer. You're about to enter the world of the gentry. You've had a glimpse into the scholarly life, but now you're about to see the full picture. You are living the privileged and intricate life of the landed gentry. This is a mainstream historical fact that few people outside of this class ever truly experienced. The gentry were the unofficial rulers of the countryside, a class of wealthy landowners and scholars who ran the day-to-day business of the empire. They were the bridge between the imperial court and the common people, a powerful class that wielded immense influence without holding official government titles. Your home is a sprawling complex of courtyards and gardens, with servants scurrying to and fro. You don't have to work. Your wealth comes from the land, which is worked by your tenants. Your days are spent in a cycle of refined pleasures, practicing calligraphy, reading poetry, and enjoying banquets with other members of your class. Your children are educated from a young age, and your son is expected to study for the civil service exams, ensuring that your family's influence continues for generations. This isn't a life of idle luxury, it's a life of constant social and political maneuvering. You must maintain your reputation, your connections, and your wealth, and you must do it all with a sense of refined elegance. Here's a quirky tidbit about the gentry's life. They were often obsessed with collecting and displaying antiquities, from ancient bronzes to rare porcelain. These objects weren't just for show, they were a way of demonstrating your long family history and your deep understanding of Chinese culture. A single, perfectly preserved vase could be a sign of your family's legitimacy and your refined taste. It's a bit like a modern-day billionaire who buys a rare painting to show off his wealth, but with way more historical and cultural significance. Historians still argue whether the gentry were a stabilizing force in Chinese society or a parasitic class that exploited the peasantry. You can see both sides. On the one hand, they provided a sense of order and stability in the countryside and often took on the role of community leaders. On the other hand, They were the ones who owned the land, and they were the ones who benefited from the labor of the common people. Their wealth and power were built on the backs of the farmers, but this elegant world is about to be turned upside down. The Ming dynasty is in decline, weakened by corruption, peasant rebellions, and a series of natural disasters. A new threat is emerging from the north, not from the Mongols this time, but from a new, powerful group of nomads. You're about to witness the end of the Ming dynasty and the arrival of the last imperial dynasty in Chinese history. You're about to see the Qing dynasty's arrival, a new chapter that will once again see China ruled by a foreign power. The elegant, if insular, world of the gentry is a fading memory. The Ming dynasty, once so glorious, has collapsed. In its place, a new power has emerged, and it's a familiar one, a foreign dynasty from the north. You are now living under the Qing dynasty, a mainstream historical fact that once again changes the very fabric of your society. The Qing are not Han Chinese, they are Manchu, a nomadic people from the northeast. They have conquered China, and they will rule it for the next 300 years. Their rule is a curious blend of old and new. On the one hand, they recognize the power of Chinese culture and tradition. They adopt the Confucian system, retain the civil service exams, and even take on the title of Son of Heaven. They understand that to rule China, they must rule as the Chinese do. On the other hand, they are determined to maintain their own cultural identity and to keep a firm grip on power. They do this by putting a new social hierarchy in place. The Manchus are at the top, and the Han Chinese are below them, a division that is both social and political. Here's a quirky tidbit about the Qing's rule. The new rulers were so obsessed with maintaining their own identity that they created a set of laws that required the Han Chinese to adopt Manchu customs. One of the most famous, and most hated, of these was the Q haircut. All Han Chinese men were forced to shave the front of their heads and wear their hair in a long braid at the back. It was a sign of submission, a physical manifestation of their new, subordinate status. To refuse was an act of rebellion, and it was punishable by death. You see the men around you, some with a new, raw-looking braid, others with their head bowed in shame. Historians still argue whether the Qing dynasty's rule was a period of cultural stagnation or a time of great prosperity and expansion. On the one hand, their rule was not as culturally open as the Tang, and their rigid social structure was a source of great resentment. On the other hand, they expanded China's borders to their greatest extent, and the empire enjoyed a period of great peace and prosperity under their rule. You can see both sides. While your social status is lower, your life might be a bit more stable, but this stability is not destined to last. A new threat is emerging, not from the north, but from the sea. Western powers, with their advanced ships and their insatiable desire for trade, are knocking on China's door. The Qing, who have been so successful at conquering on land, are completely unprepared for what's to come. You're about to witness the beginning of a new kind of war, a war that will shake the very foundations of the empire and set the stage for its eventual collapse. You're about to see the start of the Opium Wars. You've adopted the Manchu Q, a daily reminder of your new, subordinate status. But the new era of foreign influence is not coming from the north, it's coming from the sea. The Qing dynasty, for all its might, is completely unprepared for the arrival of the Western powers. They are not interested in paying tribute, they are interested in trade, and they have a new, insidious product to sell. You are now witnessing the start of the Opium Wars, a mainstream historical fact that marks the beginning of the end for Imperial China. The British, in particular, have a massive trade imbalance with China. They want Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain. But the Chinese have no interest in British goods. The British solution is to sell them opium, a powerful narcotic that they grow in their colony of India. The drug is highly addictive, and its use is spreading like wildfire through all levels of Chinese society. The Qing government, realizing the social and economic devastation the drug is causing, tries to ban it. The British, who are making a fortune from the trade, refuse to stop. The conflict that ensues is a brutal and one-sided affair. The British, with their superior naval technology and their modern weapons, are a force that the Qing army cannot match. The Chinese forces, with their outdated weapons and their lack of a modern navy, are no match for the British gunboats. You hear stories of a single British ship destroying a fleet of Chinese junks. and of a few hundred British soldiers taking on 1,000 Chinese troops. The war isn't just a military defeat, it's a psychological one. The Qing, who have always seen themselves as the center of the world, are now being humiliated by a group of foreign devils who they once dismissed as mere barbarians. Here's a quirky tidbit about the Opium Wars. The British East India Company, which was the main driver of the opium trade, was technically a private company, not the British government. But when the Qing government tried to seize their opium, the company appealed to the British government, which used the incident as a pretext for war. It's a bit like a modern-day corporation getting its home country to declare war on another country because its assets were seized, only with way more cannons and a much larger amount of opium. Historians still argue whether the Opium Wars were a necessary step to open up a closed-off China to the rest of the world, or if they were a prime example of Western imperialism and greed. You can see both sides. On the one hand, the wars did force China to open its ports and to engage with the outside world. On the other hand, the wars were fought over the right to sell an addictive and destructive drug to the Chinese people. But the Opium Wars are just the beginning. The defeat of the Qing army has exposed the weakness of the empire, and a new wave of foreigners is about to arrive. You're about to encounter a new kind of person, a merchant, a diplomat, and a missionary who will challenge Chinese authority and introduce a new set of ideas, both good and bad. You're about to meet the Westerners in the ports, and your world will never be the same. You've seen the humiliating defeat of the Qing army in the Opium Wars, and the peace treaty that followed was even more humiliating. China was forced to cede Hong Kong to the British, open 5 new ports to foreign trade, and pay a massive indemnity. The defeat exposed the Qing's weakness, and it unleashed a torrent of new challenges, not just from foreigners, but from within. You are now witnessing the chaos of the Taiping Rebellion, a mainstream historical fact that was the deadliest civil war in human history. It wasn't a small peasant uprising, it was a religious and political movement that claimed the lives of tens of millions of people. The leader of the rebellion, Hong Xiuquan, was a failed civil service exam candidate who had a series of visions after reading a Christian pamphlet. He came to believe he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ. Sent to Earth to create a new kingdom, his followers, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, were a mix of religious fanatics, disgruntled peasants, and unemployed miners. They preached a mix of Christian principles and Chinese utopianism, calling for social reforms, land redistribution, and the end of the Qing dynasty. They were a powerful force, and they swept through the southern provinces, capturing major cities and threatening the capital. The war was a brutal, no-holds-barred conflict. The Qing army, already weakened by the Opium Wars, was no match for the Taiping's fanatical zeal. Both sides committed atrocities on a massive scale. Cities were razed, and populations were massacred. The war was fought with a ferocity that had not been seen in China for centuries. You are caught in the middle of it, a bystander to a conflict that is tearing your world apart. You don't know who to trust, and you don't know where to go. The very fabric of your society is unraveling, and you are just a small, insignificant part of the unfolding tragedy. Here's a quirky tidbit about the Taiping Rebellion. The rebels, in their quest to create a new society, had some very strange and very strict rules. They banned opium, prostitution, and gambling, which sounds good, but they also banned all music, theatre, and most forms of art. They were so zealous in their beliefs that they would destroy ancient temples and burn ancient texts. It was a utopian vision, but it was also a cultural catastrophe. It's a bit like a modern-day religious movement that decides to ban all forms of entertainment, only with way more beheadings and a much larger army. Historians still argue whether the Taiping Rebellion was a genuine attempt at social and religious reform, or if it was a chaotic and destructive force that only made things worse. You can see both sides. On the one hand, the Taiping's goals of land reform and equality were radical and would have fundamentally changed Chinese society. On the other hand, their methods were brutal, and their vision of a new kingdom was both utopian and deeply flawed. The Qing dynasty, with the help of foreign powers, eventually crushed the rebellion. But the damage was done. The empire was bankrupt. The countryside was a wasteland, and the central government was weaker than ever. The defeat of the Taiping only created a power vacuum and a new figure. A woman who would rule China from behind the scenes was about to step into the void. You are about to be introduced to the powerful and controversial Empress Dowager Cixi. You've survived the brutal chaos of the Taiping Rebellion, but the peace you're experiencing is a fragile one. The Qing dynasty is indebted to the Western powers for their help in crushing the rebellion. And now a new wave of foreigners is arriving, not as soldiers, but as merchants, diplomats, and missionaries. You are encountering these Westerners in the ports, a mainstream historical fact that is changing the very rhythm of your daily life. They are a strange, unsettling presence, with their pale skin, their bizarre clothes, and their strange manners. They don't bow in the proper way. They eat with a fork and a knife, and they have no respect for your traditions. The ports, once bustling with Chinese trade, are now a hub of foreign activity. The British, the Americans, the French, and the Germans have set up their own enclaves, where they live and work under their own laws, a system known as extraterritoriality. They are not subject to Chinese law. A Westerner could commit a crime in China and be tried in his own country's court, where he would almost certainly be acquitted. This is an incredible insult to Chinese sovereignty, and it is a constant source of resentment. You might see a Chinese person being pushed out of the way by a Westerner who is in a hurry, and you know there is nothing you can do about it. Here's a quirky tidbit about the foreigners in the ports. And they were often obsessed with Chinese curiosities, from miniature figurines to ancient scrolls, but they had no understanding of the cultural significance of these objects. They would buy them for a pittance from a poor Chinese person and sell them for a fortune back home. It was a cultural ransacking, a one-way street where Chinese culture was a commodity to be bought and sold, not a sacred tradition to be respected. It's a bit like a modern-day tourist who buys a fake historical artifact from a street vendor, only with way more cultural appropriation and a much larger profit margin. Historians still argue whether the arrival of the Westerners was a benefit to China, as it brought in new technologies and ideas, or if it was a catastrophic event that led to the collapse of the empire. You can see both sides. On the one hand, the Westerners brought new technologies, like the telegraph and the railroad, that would modernize China. On the other hand, they brought with them a sense of racial superiority and an insatiable desire for profit that would lead to China's humiliation and its eventual downfall. But this period of humiliation and foreign influence also creates a new kind of power vacuum at the top. The Qing emperor is a weak figurehead, and a new person is ruling from behind the scenes. You are about to be introduced to a woman who would rule China for decades. A figure of immense power and controversy. You're about to learn about the Empress Dowager Cixi, a woman who, in her own way, was as powerful as any emperor before her. You felt the palpable humiliation of the Western presence, and now you're about to meet the woman who would have to navigate this new, dangerous world. You are in the presence of the powerful and controversial Empress Dowager Cixi, a mainstream historical fact that dominated the last decades of the Qing dynasty. She wasn't the empress, she was the mother of the emperor, but she ruled from behind a silk curtain, a woman of immense political skill and an even greater will to power. For over 40 years, she was the de facto ruler of China, a woman who controlled an empire of 400 million people. She was a brilliant and cunning politician. She outmaneuvered her rivals. She crushed rebellions. And she kept a crumbling empire from falling apart. But she was also a deeply conservative figure who resisted change and was suspicious of Western influence. She was a woman of contradictions. She was a modernizer who supported the building of railroads and telegraph lines. But she was also a traditionalist who saw the ancient ways as the only way to save China. She was a woman who ruled a vast empire from the seclusion of the Forbidden City, and she never truly understood the world outside her walls. Here's a quirky tidbit about the Empress Dowager Cixi that gives you a sense of her personality. She was obsessed with photography, a new technology that was just arriving in China. She would have herself photographed in a variety of elaborate poses. Often dressed as a Buddhist deity, she was one of the first Chinese rulers to embrace this new technology, and it was a way of projecting her power and her majesty to the outside world. It's a bit like a modern-day politician who uses social media to control their image, only with way more elaborate costumes and a much higher chance of you just thinking it's a weird old lady. Historians still argue whether the Empress Dowager Cixi was a brilliant leader who did her best to save a failing empire, or if she was a corrupt and reactionary figure who was responsible for its eventual collapse. You can see both sides. On the one hand, she did manage to keep the Qing dynasty in power for decades, and she did implement a series of reforms. On the other hand, she was a figure who was deeply suspicious of change, and her resistance to modernization ultimately left China vulnerable to a new wave of foreign humiliation. But for all her power, the Empress Dowager was at the mercy of the growing resentment of the Chinese people. The humiliation of the Opium Wars and the Taiping Rebellion had created a boiling cauldron of anger, and it was about to explode. You're about to be caught in the middle of a xenophobic uprising, a rebellion that was not directed at the Qing government but at all things foreign. You're about to be swept up in the Boxer Rebellion, a violent and chaotic event that would seal the fate of the Qing dynasty. You've witnessed the power of Empress Dowager Cixi, but now you're about to see the folly of her resistance to change. The anger and resentment against the Westerners, which had been simmering for decades, is about to boil over. You're now caught in the middle of the Boxer Rebellion, a mainstream historical fact that was a xenophobic and violent uprising aimed at expelling all foreigners from China. The Boxers, as they were known, were a group of peasants who practiced a form of martial arts and believed that their rituals and incantations made them impervious to foreign bullets. They were a mix of religious fanatics, anti-Western nationalists, and disgruntled peasants who had had enough of foreign domination. The Boxers' anger was directed at all things foreign, Westerners, Chinese Christians, and even Chinese who had adopted Western dress or customs. They would attack missionaries and Chinese Christians, often burning their churches and homes. The Qing court, with the Empress Dowager Cixi at its head, did nothing to stop them at first. In fact, they secretly encouraged them, hoping that the Boxers would be able to drive the foreigners out of China. It was a desperate gamble, and it was a terrible mistake. The Boxers marched on Beijing, and they laid siege to the foreign legations, the diplomatic quarters where the Westerners lived. The foreigners were trapped inside, surrounded by thousands of angry Boxers. They were a small group, but they were well armed, and they were determined to hold out. The siege lasted for 55 days, and it was a dramatic and violent affair. The Empress Dowager Cixi, in a stunning and misguided move, declared war on all the foreign powers at once. Here's a quirky tidbit about the Boxer Rebellion. The Boxers had a very strange set of rituals that they believed would give them supernatural powers. They would chant incantations, perform martial arts rituals, and then enter a trance-like state, believing that a spirit had entered their body and that they were now invincible. It's a bit like a modern-day superhero movie, but with way more historical consequences and a much higher chance of you getting shot. Historians still argue whether the Boxer Rebellion was a misguided and futile effort to save China from foreign domination, or if it was a patriotic and courageous struggle against Western imperialism. You can see both sides. On the one hand, the Boxers were a group of poorly armed peasants who were fighting for their country. On the other hand, their actions were violent and xenophobic, and they were ultimately responsible for the deaths of thousands of innocent people. The rebellion was a disaster for the Qing dynasty. An alliance of 8 foreign powers, including the United States, Japan, and Great Britain, sent a combined force to China to crush the rebellion. The foreign troops marched on Beijing, and they put down the rebellion with brutal force. The Empress Dowager Cixi was forced to flee, and the Qing dynasty was forced to pay another massive indemnity. The rebellion had not only failed to save China from foreign domination, it had made it even worse. The empire was now at the mercy of the foreign powers, and it was on its last legs. But for all the grand historical events you've witnessed, your life is still lived on a much smaller scale. You're about to leave the world of emperors and rebellions and enter the world of the common people, the world of the narrow, winding alleys of Beijing. You're about to see what life was really like for the average person in the heart of the empire. You're about to enter the world of the Hutongs. You've seen the great, sweeping events of history, the rise and fall of dynasties, the wars, and the rebellions. But for the vast majority of people, life was lived on a much smaller scale, a scale that was measured not in centuries, but in days. You are now navigating the narrow alleys and close-knit communities of Beijing's traditional neighborhoods, a world of Hutongs. This is a mainstream historical fact that you can still experience today, a glimpse into a time that is now mostly gone. The Hutongs are a labyrinth of winding, narrow streets and courtyards, a world that is a world away from the grand, imperial city. The Hutongs are more than just a place to live. They are a community. Everyone knows everyone. You know your neighbor's business, and they know yours. You see the same faces every day, the same street vendors, the same children playing in the streets. Your life is an open book to those around you, and theirs is to you. And the homes are small and crowded, with families living in a single room that opens onto a shared courtyard. The courtyard is the center of life, a place for children to play, for neighbors to gossip, and for laundry to hang. There is no privacy, but there is also a sense of community that is deeply comforting. Here's a quirky tidbit about life in the hutongs. The residents often had their own unique way of dealing with the lack of modern amenities. The public toilets, for example, were often a source of gossip and news. You would go to the toilet to hear the latest news, to catch up with your neighbors, and to just generally pass the time. It was a social hub, a place where the private and the public overlapped in a way that would be unimaginable today. It's a bit like a modern-day social media app, but with way more smells and a much higher chance of you being judged for your morning coffee. Historians still argue whether the hutongs were a symbol of traditional Chinese community and resilience or a sign of poverty and a lack of modern infrastructure. You can see both sides. On the one hand, the hutongs were a place of deep community and a sense of belonging that is rare in modern society. On the other hand, they were also a place of poverty, disease, and a lack of privacy that would be unacceptable today. But for all its community and its charm, life in the hutongs was a life of tradition, and the most important tradition of all was the family. You are about to be confronted with the social pressures and expectations of family, including a very big one, an arranged marriage. You're about to leave the world of the hutongs and enter the world of the family, a world that is both a source of love and a source of immense pressure. You've explored the tight-knit world of the hutongs, and now you're about to face the central institution of Chinese society, the family. You are being confronted with the social pressures and expectations of family, including a very big one, your arranged marriage. This is a mainstream historical fact that was a defining feature of life for most people in Imperial China. You don't marry for love, you marry for family. Your marriage isn't about you, it's about the union of two families, a way of building alliances, securing wealth, and continuing the family line. The process is impersonal and formal. The families of the bride and groom exchange letters, and a go-between, often an elderly woman, acts as a matchmaker. They exchange information about the family's social status, their wealth, and their reputation. You might not even meet your future spouse until the wedding day. There are no romantic evenings, no whispered promises. Your feelings are not a part of the equation. Your duty is to your family, and your duty is to marry the person they have chosen for you. To refuse would be an act of dishonor, a betrayal of your family and your ancestors. Here's a quirky tidbit about the arranged marriage process. A very important part of the negotiation was the exchange of birth dates and times, which would then be taken to a fortune teller to see if the two people's horoscopes were compatible. If they were not, the marriage would be called off. No matter how good of a match it was in every other way, it was a way of ensuring that the marriage would not only be socially and economically successful, but also cosmically blessed. It's a bit like a modern-day dating app that also uses astrology to tell you if you're a good match, but with way more family pressure and a much higher chance of you being miserable. Historians still argue whether arranged marriages were a source of social stability or a form of emotional and personal oppression. You can see both sides. On the one hand, they did create a sense of order and a stable family structure that was the foundation of Chinese society. On the other hand, they did not allow for personal choice or romantic love, and they often led to unhappy and loveless unions. Now, let's talk about a very different kind of role in the family, the role of women. We've talked about the men, the emperors, the scholars, and the farmers. But what about the women? What was their role in this patriarchal society? You're about to explore the limited but significant roles available to women in imperial society, a world that was both a source of confinement and a source of immense, if often hidden, power. You've navigated the complex, if impersonal, world of arranged marriage, and now you're about to understand a very different kind of reality. We're talking about the role of women in imperial China, a mainstream historical fact that was a world of both confinement and immense, if often hidden, power. While a woman's life was centered on the family and the domestic sphere, her influence was far from insignificant. Her life was defined by the Confucian ideals of obedience and subordination. but she was also a source of stability and continuity in the family line. A woman's journey was often a series of transitions, from daughter to wife to mother-in-law. Her value was not in her individual self, but in her relationship to others. As a daughter, she was expected to be obedient to her father. As a wife, she was expected to be subservient to her husband and his family. And as a mother, she was expected to bear sons to continue the family line. But as she aged and became a mother-in-law, her status and power grew. An elderly matriarch could be a formidable figure, a woman who controlled the family's finances, managed the household, and held immense influence over her sons and their wives. Here's a quirky tidbit about the power of women. While they were not allowed to hold political office or take the civil service exams, they often had a great deal of informal power. A mother could influence her son's decisions, a wife could influence her husband's business dealings, and a concubine could have the emperor's ear. This was an open secret in Chinese society. It's a bit like a modern-day political wife who works behind the scenes to influence her husband's career, but with way more intricate rules and a much higher chance of a palace coup. Historians still argue whether the Confucian ideals of female obedience were a form of oppression or a way of creating a stable and harmonious society. You can see both sides. On the one hand, the rules did limit a woman's individual freedom and her opportunities for education and a career. On the other hand, the system did provide a clear sense of order and a predictable path for a woman's life. Now, let's turn our attention to a very different kind of ritual, one that was a daily part of life for all classes, from the emperor to the common farmer. It wasn't about power or politics, it was about culture, tradition, and a quiet moment of contemplation. You're about to be introduced to the art of tea, a simple drink that was a cornerstone of Chinese culture. You're about to see how a simple cup of tea can be a source of pleasure, a sign of respect, and a window into a world of tradition. You've understood the intricate role of women in the family, and now you're about to be introduced to a ritual that was a cornerstone of daily life for both men and women, rich and poor. We're talking about the art of tea, a mainstream historical fact that was so much more than a simple drink. It was a social ritual, a form of medicine, and a way of life that permeated every level of society. It was a simple act that was imbued with a deep sense of meaning. Tea was first used as a medicinal herb, but by the Tang dynasty, it was a social drink that was enjoyed by everyone. You would sit with a friend, a family member, or a business associate and drink tea. The preparation of the tea was a ritual in itself, a careful and deliberate process that was meant to be a form of meditation. The tea leaves would be roasted, ground into a powder, and then whisked with hot water. The act of preparing the tea was as important as the act of drinking it. It was a moment of quiet contemplation, a time to slow down and to appreciate the simple pleasures of life. Here's a quirky tidbit about tea culture. The Chinese had a saying, "The first cup is to drink, the second is to enjoy, and the third is to contemplate." This was a way of saying that the first cup was for thirst, the second was for pleasure, and the third was for a deeper, more spiritual experience. The act of drinking tea was a way of connecting with your inner self and with the world around you. It's a bit like a modern-day mindfulness exercise, but with way more elaborate teacups and a much higher chance of you getting a caffeine buzz. Historians still argue whether the Chinese love of tea was a result of its health benefits or if it was a cultural habit that was developed over time. You can see both sides. On the one hand, tea does have health benefits, and the Chinese were well aware of them. On the other hand, the ritual and the social aspect of drinking tea were so ingrained in the culture that it's hard to separate the two. But for all its quiet contemplation, the art of tea was still a part of a larger world, a world that was governed by a very different kind of ritual. We're talking about the rituals of the dead, the spiritual beliefs that guided every aspect of daily life. You're about to be introduced to the world of ancestor worship, a tradition that was a source of comfort, a source of fear, and a force that you could not escape. You've seen the quiet contemplation of the art of tea, but now you're about to be introduced to a very different kind of ritual, one that was a source of comfort and a source of fear. We're talking about ancestor worship, a mainstream historical fact that was the foundation of Chinese spiritual life. It wasn't a religion in the Western sense of the word. It was a spiritual practice that guided every aspect of daily life. The dead were not truly gone, they were still a part of your family, and their spirits were a powerful force that could bless you or curse you. The practice was simple but deeply ingrained. Every family had a small altar in their home, a place where they would offer incense, food, and drink to the spirits of their ancestors. You would talk to your ancestors, ask them for their guidance, and thank them for their blessings. You would light candles and burn paper money, cars, and even houses, believing that the smoke would carry the objects to the afterlife, where your ancestors could use them. It was a way of honoring the past, of connecting with your family history, and of ensuring that your family line would continue for generations. Here's a quirky tidbit about ancestor worship. The Chinese believed that the spirits of the dead could get lonely or bored in the afterlife, so they would often burn paper servants, paper horses, and even paper money to keep them company. It was a way of ensuring that your ancestors would be happy and comfortable in the afterlife, and it was a way of showing your devotion. It's a bit like a modern-day person who sends a care package to their friend in another country, but with way more fire and a much higher chance of you just thinking it's a bunch of weird paper objects. Historians still argue whether ancestor worship was a force for good in Chinese society, or if it was a patriarchal system that reinforced social hierarchies and a male-dominated family structure. You can see both sides. On the one hand, it did create a sense of family and a deep connection to the past. On the other hand, it did reinforce the idea that the male line was the only one that mattered, and it often led to a deep sense of social and family pressure. Now, let's talk about a very different kind of spiritual belief, one that was not a part of daily life but was celebrated once a year with a massive, eerie festival. You're about to be introduced to the hungry ghosts, and you're about to take part in a festival that is both a celebration and a source of deep fear. You're about to experience the Ghost Festival. You've seen the solemn duty of ancestor worship, but now you're about to be introduced to a more chaotic and terrifying spiritual belief. We're talking about the Hungry Ghost Festival, a mainstream historical fact that was a massive, nationwide event. It was a time when the gates of hell were opened, and the spirits of the dead, the hungry ghosts, were released to roam the earth for a month. These weren't your ancestors, these were the spirits of people who had died a bad death, or who had no one to worship them. They were angry, lonely, and hungry, and they were a force to be reckoned with. During the Ghost Festival, which was held in the 7th lunar month, people would do everything they could to appease the hungry ghosts. You would leave food on the sidewalk for the ghosts to eat. You would burn paper money and incense to keep them from getting angry. You would avoid going out at night, and you would avoid the water, believing that the ghosts would try to pull you under. It was a time of fear and of superstition, a time when the spiritual world and the real world collided in a very real way. Here's a quirky tidbit about the Hungry Ghost Festival. The Chinese would often put on elaborate puppet shows and opera performances for the ghosts. These performances were held in the open air, and the first row of seats was always left empty, a sign that the ghosts were welcome to come and sit and enjoy the show. It was a way of entertaining the ghosts, of keeping them happy and from causing trouble. It's a bit like a modern-day person who throws a party for a group of people who are not invited, but with way more ghost puppets and a much higher chance of you being terrified. Historians still argue whether the Ghost Festival was a genuine spiritual belief or a way of controlling the masses with fear and superstition. You can see both sides. On the one hand, the festival did provide a sense of order and a way of dealing with the fear of the unknown. On the other hand, it did reinforce a sense of superstition and a belief in a spiritual world that was more terrifying than comforting. Now, let's turn our attention to a very different kind of festival, one that was a source of great joy and a massive family reunion. You're about to be introduced to the most important festival of the year, a time of celebration, of family, and of hope for the future. You're about to experience the Lunar New Year. You've navigated the eerie world of the hungry ghosts, and now you're about to experience the most important and most joyful festival of the year. We're talking about the Lunar New Year, a mainstream historical fact that was a time of massive celebration, of family reunions, and of a collective sense of hope for the future. It wasn't just a single day, it was a festival that lasted for weeks, a time when work stopped, and life was centered on the family. You're about to see how a simple festival can be a source of great joy and a deep sense of connection to your family and your culture. The festival was all about family. People would travel for days, weeks, or even months to return to their hometowns and celebrate with their parents and their grandparents. The celebrations were loud and boisterous, filled with firecrackers, drumming, and colourful lion dances. You would wear new clothes, eat a feast of traditional foods, and give out red envelopes filled with money to the children. It was a time of looking back on the year that had passed and a time of looking forward to the year to come. Here's a quirky tidbit about the Lunar New Year. The Chinese believed that the way you started the new year would determine the way the rest of your year would go. So, you had to be very careful. You couldn't sweep your house on the first day of the new year, because you would be sweeping away all your good luck. You couldn't argue with your family members, because you would be starting the year with a fight, and you couldn't say any bad words. It was a way of ensuring that your year would be filled with good luck, happiness, and prosperity. It's a bit like a modern-day person who makes a New Year's resolution, but with way more rules and a much higher chance of you just being stressed out. Historians still argue whether the Lunar New Year was a genuine source of joy and a way of celebrating family, or if it was a holiday that reinforced social hierarchies and a sense of duty and obligation. You can see both sides. On the one hand, it was a time of great joy and a sense of connection to your family and your culture. On the other hand, it was a time when you were expected to perform a series of rituals and to spend time with people you might not even like. Now, let's turn our attention to a very different kind of knowledge. One that was a mix of science, religion, and superstition. You're about to be introduced to the world of medicine, a world that was a mix of herbal remedies and spiritual beliefs. You're about to see how a simple doctor could be a healer, a spiritual guide, and a charlatan all at once. You've celebrated the new year, but you're now about to be confronted with a more common and a more somber reality: illness. You are seeking medical help from a practitioner who blends herbs and spiritual beliefs. A mainstream historical fact that was the basis of all medicine in Imperial China. There was no separation between the body, the mind, and the spirit. An illness was not just a physical problem, it was a sign of a spiritual or a cosmic imbalance. The doctor's job was not just to cure the disease, but to restore the harmony of your body and your spirit. The doctor is a wise old man with a long beard and a calm, reassuring manner. He doesn't just look at your body, he looks at your entire life. He asks you about your diet, your sleep, your mood, and your relationships. He feels your pulse in 3 different places on your wrist, each one corresponding to a different organ. He looks at your tongue, and he looks at your eyes. He is trying to understand the flow of qi, the life force that flows through your body. An illness is a sign that your qi is blocked, and his job is to unblock it. He prescribes you a series of herbs, which are a mix of roots, leaves, and animal parts, all of which are ground into a powder and mixed with water. Here's a quirky tidbit about Chinese medicine. The doctors were often obsessed with the idea of a balanced diet. They believed that food was medicine and that a person's diet was a key to their health. They would prescribe a series of foods that were believed to have a certain kind of energy, and they would tell you to avoid foods that had a different kind of energy. It was a way of maintaining the balance of your body, and it was a way of preventing illness. It's a bit like a modern-day person who goes on a diet, but with way more strange roots and a much higher chance of you just being told to eat more vegetables. Historians still argue whether traditional Chinese medicine was a genuine form of healing or if it was a mix of superstition and placebo. You can see both sides. On the one hand, many of the herbs and remedies did have real medicinal properties. On the other hand, a lot of the practices were based on spiritual beliefs that had no basis in science. You are just a patient, and you just hope that your doctor knows what he's doing. Now, let's talk about what happens when you don't follow the rules. We've talked about the laws, the social norms, and the spiritual beliefs that govern your life. But what happens when you break them? You're about to be introduced to the harsh and often public punishments that were meted out for crimes. You're about to see the dark side of Imperial China, a world of law and order that was a lot less gentle than you might imagine. You've had a taste of Chinese medicine, a world of balance and harmony. But you're now about to be confronted with a world that is all about imbalance and disharmony. We're talking about punishment and justice, a mainstream historical fact that was a brutal and public spectacle. The law was not just a system of rules, it was a moral code that was enforced with a terrifying and often public display of power. A crime was not just an act against a person, it was an act against the emperor, and it was an act against the cosmic order. The punishments were often harsh and often public. You might see a thief being led through the streets with a wooden board around his neck, a sign of his crime and a warning to others. You might see a man being publicly flogged for a minor offense. You might even see a man being beheaded for a major crime. The public punishments were a way of teaching the people a lesson, a way of reminding them that the law was not to be trifled with. It was a show of force, a display of power that was meant to instill fear and to maintain order. Here's a quirky tidbit about Chinese justice. The Chinese had a system of collective punishment. If one person in a family or a village committed a crime, the entire family or village could be punished. The idea was that a family or a village should have been able to prevent the crime from happening in the first place. It was a way of reinforcing the idea of collective responsibility and of social control. It's a bit like a modern-day boss who punishes the entire team for one person's mistake, only with way more public humiliation and a much higher chance of you being beaten. Historians still argue whether the harsh punishments of the Qing dynasty were a necessary evil to maintain order or if they were a sign of a brutal and inhumane system. You can see both sides. On the one hand, the harsh punishments did deter crime and did maintain a sense of order in a massive empire. On the other hand, the punishments were often cruel and inhumane, and they were often meted out without a fair trial. Now, let's talk about the strange and tragic fate of a man who was once at the very top of the social ladder. We've talked about the eunuchs, the scholars, and the emperors. But what happens when a man at the very top of the social ladder falls? You're about to learn about the rise and often tragic fall of a powerful eunuch. You're about to see how a man who was a symbol of power could also be a symbol of a tragic fate. You've seen the harsh reality of Chinese justice. And now you're about to be introduced to a very different kind of tragedy. You're learning about the Grand Eunuch's fate, a mainstream historical fact that was a common, and often grim, story. The Grand Eunuch was a man who, by virtue of his castration, had risen to the very top of the imperial court. He was a man who wielded immense power, a man who was feared and respected by everyone. From the emperor to the lowest servant, he was a symbol of the ultimate power that could be wielded from behind the scenes. But his power was a precarious one. It was all dependent on the whim of the emperor and the machinations of his rivals. A Grand Eunuch's fall could be as swift and as dramatic as his rise. A single misstep, a political miscalculation, or a change in the emperor's favor could lead to a swift and brutal end. He could be exiled, imprisoned, or even executed, and when a Grand Eunuch fell, he fell hard. All of his wealth, all of his power, and all of his influence would be gone in a heartbeat. He would be a pariah, a man who was once at the top of the world and was now nothing. It was a terrifying and often brutal reminder that power was an illusion, and that a man who was once everything could be nothing in a moment. Here's a quirky tidbit about the Grand Eunuch's fate. When a powerful eunuch was executed, and his body was often not given a proper burial, it was a way of showing that he was a symbol of a corrupt and a failed system, and that his life was not worth a proper burial. It was a way of erasing him from history, a way of showing that his power was a fleeting and an ultimately meaningless thing. It's a bit like a modern-day CEO who is fired from a company and then has their name scrubbed from the company's website. But with way more public humiliation and a much higher chance of you just thinking it's a bunch of weird symbolism. Historians still argue whether the Grand Eunuch's fall was a sign of a corrupt and a failed system, or if it was a necessary evil to ensure that no one person could wield too much power. You can see both sides. On the one hand, the Grand Eunuch's power was a threat to the stability of the empire. On the other hand, the way he was treated after his fall was a sign of a brutal and an inhumane system. But for all the drama and the tragedy of the Grand Eunuch's fate, the empire continued to move forward, and it continued to keep a close eye on its people. You're about to be introduced to a very different kind of power, a power that was all about numbers, and a power that was all about control. You're about to see how the state kept a record of every single person in the empire. You're about to be subjected to the all-seeing eye of the state's meticulously detailed census. You've witnessed the tragic fall of a Grand Eunuch, but for the vast majority of people, life went on, and life was still meticulously monitored by the state. You are now being subjected to the imperial census, a mainstream historical fact that was an all-seeing and a deeply intrusive system. The state was not just interested in your taxes, it was interested in your life. It wanted to know who you were, where you lived, how many people were in your family, and what you did for a living. It wanted to know everything. The census was a massive, nationwide undertaking. Officials would travel from village to village, from city to city, and they would ask you a series of questions. You would be expected to give them all the information they wanted. and you would be expected to give it to them truthfully. The information was then recorded on a series of scrolls, and it was used to create a detailed record of every single person in the empire. The census was a way of controlling the population, of conscripting soldiers, and of collecting taxes. It was a way of ensuring that every single person was a part of the system, and that every single person was accountable to the state. Here's a quirky tidbit about the imperial census. The Chinese had a system of household registration that was so meticulous that it would even record the age and the gender of a person who had died. The idea was that the state was not just interested in the living, it was interested in the dead as well. It was a way of ensuring that a person could not escape the system, even in death. It's a bit like a modern-day government that keeps a record of every single person who has ever lived, but with way more scrolls and a much higher chance of you just being annoyed. Historians still argue whether the imperial census was a necessary tool to manage a massive empire, or if it was a system of social control that was designed to oppress the people. You can see both sides. On the one hand, the census did provide the state with a way of managing a massive population and of ensuring that everyone paid their taxes. On the other hand, the census was a deeply intrusive system that was a sign of a society that was all about control and a lack of personal freedom. But for all its meticulous control, the Qing dynasty was not destined to last. A new force was emerging, one that was not a rebellion or a foreign army, but an idea. You're about to witness the final days of the Qing dynasty and the fall of the empire. You're about to see a world that has been a constant for thousands of years come to an end, a world that will be replaced by a new and a very different kind of society. You've been counted, recorded, and filed away by the imperial census. But you're now standing at a precipice of history, witnessing the end of an era. This is a mainstream historical fact that is both tragic and inevitable. The Qing dynasty, which had ruled China for 300 years, is on its last legs. It's not a sudden collapse, but a slow, grinding decline, a series of humiliating defeats, internal rebellions, and a growing sense of a world that is passing by. The once mighty empire is now a sick man, a country that is being propped up by a series of weak emperors and corrupt officials. The signs are everywhere. The foreign powers, which you've already seen, are carving up China into spheres of influence, and they are openly disrespectful of Chinese sovereignty. The economy is in shambles. The countryside is racked by famine and poverty, and the central government has lost all authority. The people, who have been so patient for so long, are now openly rebellious. The traditional systems, the mandate of heaven, the civil service exams, and the emperor's power are now seen as archaic and irrelevant. The very foundations of the empire are crumbling. Here's a quirky tidbit about the final days of the Qing. The last emperor, Puyi, came to the throne as a child and was a symbol of the empire's decline. He was a powerless figurehead, a boy who was trapped in the forbidden city while the world outside his walls was changing at a dizzying pace. He was a living symbol of a dying empire, a tragic figure who was a part of a world that was no longer real. It's a bit like a modern-day person who is still living in a time that is long past, but with way more silk robes and a much higher chance of you just being sad for them. Historians still argue whether the Qing dynasty's fall was inevitable or if it could have been saved by a series of reforms. You can see both sides. On the one hand, the empire was facing a series of internal and external challenges that were almost impossible to overcome. On the other hand, the Qing's resistance to change and their arrogance in the face of a changing world did contribute to their downfall. The final act of the Qing dynasty is not a tragic battle or a grand revolution, but a quiet abdication. The last emperor, a boy, abdicates his throne, and the long, long history of imperial China comes to an end. The empire is gone, but the country is still here. And it is a country that is in a state of chaos and uncertainty. You're about to see the promise and the chaos of a new, post-imperial China struggling to be born. You're about to enter the world of the Republic, a world that is a lot more chaotic and a lot less certain. The emperor is gone, and a new era has begun. You are now witnessing the Republic's uncertain dawn, a mainstream historical fact that marks the end of imperial China and the beginning of a new, and often chaotic, chapter. The Qing dynasty, which had ruled for 300 years, has been replaced by a republic, a new form of government that is based on Western ideals of democracy and freedom. The new government, however, is weak and divided. It is a new world, but it is a world that is not a lot more stable than the one that it replaced. The promise of the Republic is a world of freedom, of democracy, and of a new, modern China. The reality is a world of warlords, of political assassinations, and of civil war. The country is divided between different factions, each one with its own army and its own vision for the future. The common people are caught in the middle, a pawn in a larger game that they do not understand. The old certainties, the mandate of heaven, the emperor, and the Confucian system are all gone, and there is nothing to replace them. It is a time of great hope and a time of great despair, a time of new beginnings and a time of old problems. Here's a quirky tidbit about the early republic. The new government, in a move that was both symbolic and impractical, changed the national calendar from the traditional lunar calendar to the Western solar calendar. It was a way of showing that China was now a part of the modern world, a way of breaking with the past. But for the average person, it was a change that was confusing and disorienting. It's a bit like a modern-day government that decides to change the day of the week, but with way more social and historical consequences. Historians still argue whether the fall of the Qing dynasty and the rise of the Republic was a good thing or a bad thing for China. On the one hand, the Republic did bring new ideas and a sense of freedom to the country. On the other hand, it also led to a period of chaos and civil war that would last for decades. But for all its chaos and its uncertainty, the Republic is a new beginning. It is a new chapter in a very long history, a history that is still being written today. You are now standing at the end of your journey, a journey that has taken you from the Qin dynasty to the Republic. You have seen the rise and fall of dynasties, the wars, and the rebellions. You have seen the emperors, the scholars, and the common people. You have seen a world that is both a source of great beauty and a source of great suffering. You are about to reflect on the legacy of Imperial China and how its long history still shapes the world today. You've seen the uncertain dawn of the Republic, but now you're about to reflect on a deeper truth. The fall of the empire wasn't the end of a story, it was a transition. You are now reflecting on how Imperial China's long history still shapes the world today. This is a mainstream historical fact that is impossible to ignore. The past is not gone, it is still here. In the language you speak, in the food you eat, in the way you interact with your family, and in the way you see the world. The legacy of Imperial China is a part of the air you breathe. The first thing you notice is the language, the Chinese language, with its thousands of characters, is a direct link to the past. The characters you read and write today are a direct descendant of the characters that were used thousands of years ago. The language is a living history, a way of connecting with a past that is not gone but is still here, in every single word you speak. The second thing you notice is the family. The family, with its deep sense of duty and obligation, is still a central institution in Chinese society. The idea of filial piety, of respecting your elders and honoring your ancestors, is still a powerful force. The family is not just a group of people, it is a source of identity, a source of stability, and a source of connection to a past that is not gone but is still here. Here's a quirky tidbit about the legacy of Imperial China. The Chinese calendar, with its zodiac animals and its complex system of lucky and unlucky days, is still used today. It's a way of connecting with a past that is not gone but is still here, in the way you plan your life and in the way you see the world. It's a bit like a modern-day person who still uses a sundial to tell time, but with way more fortune-telling and a much higher chance of you just being superstitious. Historians still argue whether the legacy of Imperial China is a source of strength or a source of weakness. On the one hand, the deep sense of history and the powerful sense of family and community are a source of great strength. On the other hand, the traditional systems of social control and the patriarchal nature of the family are a source of weakness. The end of the empire wasn't the end of a story, it was a transition. The past is still here, and it will continue to shape the future. You've reached the end of the line, the final stop on our long journey through the history of Imperial China. It's time to wind down, to let the images and the feelings of this long, long story fade into the background. Your mind is probably tired from all the marching, all the studying, all the feasting, and all the famine. That's okay. Let it go. The Qin's rigid control, the Han's endless bureaucracy, the Tang's glittering poetry, the Song's ingenious inventions, and the Ming's grand isolation, let them all become a soft, distant hum in your memory. You're no longer on that dusty road. worried about a misplaced word or a looming census. You're not in the cramped Hutong or the grand, foreboding forbidden city. You are safe. You are warm. Think back to the small things, the scratch of a hemp robe, the scent of wood smoke on a cool evening, the quiet splash of water in a Grand Canal lock, the taste of a bitter tea on your tongue, the feel of a quill in your hand, the ache of your back after a long day in the fields, the sudden, terrifying sound of a Mongol horseman's cry. These are the moments that made up a life that you wouldn't have lasted a day in, a life that was, in its own way, beautiful and terrifying and deeply human. The emperor's power, the eunuch's deceit, the scholar's grace, and the peasant's struggle, they all fade now, like a wisp of smoke from a distant fire. The world you journeyed through is long, long gone, but its echoes are still here, in the stories we tell, in the history we study, and in the traditions that still remain. So, as you close your eyes, let the final image be a calm one, not of an army, but of a single lantern, flickering softly in a quiet Hutong alley, not of a great feast, but of a simple bowl of rice on a wooden table, not of an emperor, but of a single child, playing quietly in a courtyard. A future still unwritten. The past is a place we visit to understand the present. But now, it's time to let the past rest. It's time to rest too. May your dreams be peaceful and your sleep be deep. Sweet dreams. End of script. Sweet dreams.